on my watch, we might make a start. Is everybody ready to go?
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you first for everyone coming at short notice to discuss this extremely serious issue. We very much appreciate it, and thank you for those senators appearing as well. I declare open the hearing of the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport References Committee into the adequacy of Australia's biosecurity measures and response preparedness. Today's hearing is a hybrid hearing, with some senators and witnesses appearing in person and others appearing via video and teleconference. I thank you all for bearing with us as we make sure the technology works okay. For the benefit of witnesses, I am the Chair, Senator Matthew Canavan. I believe we have Senators White and Ciccone, and Senator McDonald has joined us as well, and there will, I'm sure, be some others coming in later. Welcome to all of you. Senators should note that I will be relatively strict with the allocation of time, given the numbers of senators interested in this topic. We've set up a WhatsApp group, if you're not on it, so monitor that for rotating the call. These are public proceedings being video streamed live via Parliament's website, and a handscript transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It's unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated as by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses also have the right to request to be heard in camera. Today we'll hear from a number of representatives of government agencies involved in Australia's biosecurity response. The Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the ground on which it is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Commonwealth officers appearing today are also reminded of the Senate order specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. A copy of the order is available from the Secretariat. I remind committee members and witnesses who are appearing via video conference or teleconference to please mute your microphones when you're not speaking. Thank you very much for doing so. I now welcome Secretary Mr Andrew Metcalfe and representatives from the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. I also welcome representatives from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Australian Border Force. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear? I think we might limit that to those at the table for now, and then obviously if others come forward, they can say that as we go. So over to you, Secretary Metcalfe.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. Andrew Metcalfe, Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestries. Chair and Senators, I'd like to make a brief opening statement. I'd like to very much thank you for the opportunity to appear here today. As Senator Canavan indicated, I'm joined by a range of senior officers from my department and also colleagues from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Australian Border Force. My department will, of course, provide a detailed written submission to your inquiry later this month. Chair and Senators, as you'd be aware, yesterday Minister Watt launched Australia's new Biosecurity Strategy 2022 to 2032, building on the Commonwealth Biosecurity Strategy 2030 launched last year. The national strategy was developed over the last year by my department, working in very close cooperation with all state and territory jurisdictions and key areas of industry, guided by a reference group. We have copies of the biosecurity strategy available here today, which we'll make available to the committee now. The strategy is very much a roadmap for our system, our biosecurity system, over the next 10 years. It's focused on the increased and changing biosecurity threats that are closer and more threatening than ever before. It clearly states that our biosecurity system needs to be continually strengthened so that we can collectively better address challenges as they emerge as a connected, resilient and shared responsibility. Senators, the first incursion of an exotic pest or disease in modern times in Australia arrived with the First Fleet. Prickly pears were imported as hosts of cochineal insects used to produce the distinctive red dye used in British soldiers' uniforms at the time. Subsequently, other varieties were introduced as hedges and fodder and quickly spread to the dry inland climate west of the Great Divide, ultimately rendering 40,000 square kilometres of farming land unproductive. My grandparents were forced to abandon their farm in Roma in southern Queensland in 1929 due to the prickly pear infestation, just prior to the widespread introduction of Cactoblastus cactorum, a moth from South America whose larvae eat prickly pear. Travellers along the Warrego Highway will notice that the Cactoblastus moth is celebrated in a memorial hall at Banaga near Chinchilla, west of Toowoomba. The Commonwealth's powers around quarantine and biosecurity are derived from the Australian Constitution through Section 51, Part 9. The Quarantine Act 1908 was replaced by the current Biosecurity Act 2015. The legislative scheme is based on the premise that federal legislation will regulate goods and conveyances as they enter Australia to effectively manage biosecurity risk, while also having powers to assess, manage and identify onshore a pest or disease incursion. The Commonwealth's biosecurity scheme operates concurrently with state and territory domestic controls. Between the Commonwealth and states and territories, Australia has a world-class biosecurity system. Pursuant to Section 540 of the Act, I am Australia's Director of Biosecurity, given that I am the Agriculture Secretary. The Department's submission to the inquiry will provide more detail, but I note that our modern biosecurity system has been developed following a range of reviews by many eminent Australians, including the 1996 NAN report, the 2008 and 2012 Beale Review, the 2011 Matthews Review on foot and mouth disease readiness, the 2017 Craik Intergovernmental Agreement on Biosecurity Review, and of course the 2007 Royal Commission on Equine Influenza. The Biosecurity Act also establishes the Inspector General of Biosecurity with powers to review the performance of functions or exercise of powers by biosecurity officials under the Biosecurity Act. This includes information gathering and compulsion of evidence giving powers similar to our Royal Commission. As you'd be aware, a new Inspector General of Biosecurity, Dr Lloyd Crump, has recently commenced in the role, replacing Mr Rob Delane, who served with distinction over a number of years. Chair and Senators, foot and mouth disease and varroa mite, which are the particular focus of your inquiry, have been the focus of biosecurity authorities and industry associations' attention for many, many years. Approximately 70 countries are known to have foot and mouth disease, with Indonesia the most recently infected country after 30 years of freedom from the disease. Australia's biosecurity controls are set to prevent the introduction and subsequent exposure of Australian animals to FMD and have done this successfully for 150 years since the last outbreak in 1872 in Werribee. The AusVet plan contains the nationally agreed approach for the response to emergency animal disease incidents in Australia, shared across the Commonwealth, all jurisdictions and with Animal Health Australia. The experience from FMD outbreaks in the United Kingdom, the last in 2007, which caused crisis in British agriculture right through to British tourism, have informed further measures to strengthen our preparedness and readiness. These measures have been further strengthened in recent times, given that FMD is now again present in Indonesia, as well, of course, is lumpy skin disease. The response to the recent incursion of varroa mite in New South Wales is based on planning over several years with the Commonwealth, all jurisdictions, Plant Health Australia and the bee industry. The National Bee Surveillance Program acts as an early warning system to detect new incursions of exotic bee pests and pest bees by monitoring locations considered to be the most likely entry points throughout Australia. Ongoing investment in the biosecurity system is guided by experts in my department and partnerships with the states and territories, CSIRO, the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, the Centre for Excellence in Biosecurity Analysis based in Melbourne University, and international bodies such as the World Organisation for Animal Health. In conclusion, Chair and Senators, can I assure the committee and broader community that we are not complacent. We are never complacent. We fully understand the consequences of these pests and diseases. We have mobilised all available resources, our networks across industry and government and international partners to keep Australia FMD and LSD free. We are of course open to new ideas and very much welcome any suggestions or views from the committee. We are enlisting the best minds in biosecurity in Australia and leading extensive engagement with industry leaders. At the same time, we are also managing COVID impacts on our workforce like all workforces and have moved key leadership staff to bolster resources at the border, at airports, ports and mail centres. We of course will provide extensive evidence today in response to your questions about FMD, LSD and varroamide, so I won't expand further now. We of course are happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Metcalfe. Appreciate that statement. I might just ask the other officials at the table to introduce themselves, other senators, particularly those online.
Thank you, Chair. Chris Locke is my name. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Biosecurity and Compliance.
Chair, Senators, good morning. Beth Cookson, I'm the Acting Australian Chief Veterinary Officer.
Good morning, Emily Follett. I'm Assistant Secretary of the Agriculture and Non-Tariff Barriers Branch in Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Good morning, Robert Ferguson, Assistant Secretary Indonesia Branch, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
And I'm Chris Parker, the Exotic Animal Disease Preparedness Task Force Head.
Well, thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. You probably saw on the agenda we're going to focus questions for this first hour on foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, and then move to varroamite. I just want to check that we do have a lot of senators. Is there any hard markers for officials? Because I'm happy to be a little bit flexible with the overall time. If there are any issues with timing, could you let us know?
No, we're available for the entire hearing, of course, Senator, and we have officials who can speak on both of those matters. So,
great. Thank you, Secretary. So I just had a few questions to kick off with, and thank you for the opening statement. Obviously, it's a very serious risk to not just the agricultural industry, but to the entire Australian economy. There have been a number of announcements over the past month to reduce that risk. I just wanted to check on some of those and to what extent they've been rolled out. Starting with the foot mats, are they in all airports that are receiving flights from Indonesia today?
we'll just ask the relevant officer to come to the table, Senator, and I'll ask
if
you...
they could just...
yes, the head of our Border Operations Division.
They haven't.
Morning, Chair, and morning, Senators. Colin Hunter, First Assistant Secretary of Biosecurity Operations Division. Our foot mats have now been deployed to all international airports that receive direct flights from Indonesia.
And on what date were they all in? Were 100% of the airports covered with foot mats?
So the operationalisation of foot mats occurred over a couple of days. So the biosecurity risk zone determination was made on or around about the 22nd of July. And then we commenced the rollout of foot mats from the 26th of July. All were operational by the 27th.
By the 27th, okay. And so from the 27th, how many passengers from Indonesia have arrived in Australia, and what proportion of those went through the foot mats, so to speak?
So since late afternoon of the 27th of July, all passengers, to my knowledge, except probably one or two, have now crossed the foot mats. If you just give me a moment, Senator, I can get the numbers of passengers that I'd estimate that have crossed those.
You can take that on notice if you like, and you possibly could tell us later so we can keep moving on. And moving on, I believe the government had also announced additional detector dogs as well. Are detector dogs in all airports receiving passengers from Indonesia now?
All airports except Adelaide, and we're making arrangements for a detector dog to be deployed to Adelaide by the end of the month.
Okay. How do these dogs work? Do they sniff people on a risk basis, or do sort of all passengers kind of get screened, so to speak?
Depending on the logistics of the airport, Senator, but mostly we have the dogs at what I call the back of the hall, where people have been profiled and then allow the dogs to sniff luggage and the like. However,
is all luggage sniffed?
If they're lined up in front of the detector dogs, it is. So that's all the hand luggage as well as the luggage that's been on in the hold of the flight. In some locations, we've begun to move the detector dogs as well out around the baggage carousel areas. We're just sort of operationally setting the wheels in motion for that. So in some airports, we have got the detector dogs already doing that.
Okay. And in terms of another announcement was that they're helping Indonesia with access to vaccines for foot and mouth disease. I believe we announced 1 million initially, and there might have been some more announcements this week. How many vaccines has Australia provided to Indonesia to date?
Senator Chris Parker, the vaccines, the million-odd doses of vaccines will arrive in Indonesia on the 22nd of this month. And that's in line after discussing with Indonesians about the best way that they would like the second tranche of vaccines rolled out. Just for clarity, Indonesia purchased 3 million doses of foot and mouth disease vaccine. They've now administered over 1 million of those doses, and we'll continue to make vaccine commitments in line with Indonesia's response plan.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Parker. Last question from me for now. I think you also announced, the government had announced 18 new biosecurity officers to be based in airports and mail centres. How many of those 18 have been deployed, and if not all, when would we expect them to be on the ground?
So we've commenced recruitment action for those biosecurity officers, Senator. The applications closed for those on or around about the 22nd of August. We expect them to be deployed by the end of September. However, in the meantime, I would emphasise that that we have used the funding that's not being deployed against those at the moment to surge with contractors at airport locations, and we've placed 45 contractors in lieu of those biosecurity officers at all airports that are receiving flights from Indonesia. There's another 20 to be deployed on top of that. And then in addition to that, Senator, maybe just if I could have the liberty just to sort of say that, you know, this is all hands to the pump from my perspective, and I do want to recognise the hard efforts of all of the biosecurity officers around Australia that, you know, to continuously get out of bed early in the morning, to go to protect our nation from exotic pests and diseases like foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. But in addition to that, I'm also deploying people out of Canberra and policy areas to international airports to assist with leadership and various functions. So very much all hands to the pump, but those officers that you asked about the recruitment is in train for that, but we have actually deployed contractors in lieu of that in the meantime.
I might just add to that.
Thank you, Graham.
I just add to that, Senator Qantas received some publicity recently about requiring some of their management staff to work in operational roles, and we were probably a week or two ahead of them, I think, in that we actually are doing everything we can to ensure that we've got as many staff at those key entry points at airports, mail centres and ports. So.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you for that, officials. Senator Ciccone, I'll go to you.
Thanks a lot, Chair, and good morning to the officials. Just on the foot mats, could you please talk through, for me and the benefit of the committee, the process to procure these mats?
Thanks, Senator. So the procurement is not unlike any other Commonwealth procurement exercise. It has ensured value for money, but it's also ensured the availability of mats. These things, I've got to say, when we first started the process, weren't easy to identify. So the logistics to identify them, the logistics to obtain them, the logistics to deploy them were considerable. So all Commonwealth procurement guidelines have been followed. We had an initial mat supplier from northern New South Wales, and we've now begun to expand the supplier approach around those foot mats, given sort of the experience that we've had at the border.
Senator, I just sort of add to that by saying that sort of mats aren't mats. The particular mats that were required, which are of obviously an industrial standard, able to deal with many sets of feet walking across them every day, but also able to hold and retain a fluid in the sense of citric acid. So a mat that was able to, on the one hand, have the effect of brushing soil or dirt off, but at the same time bathing in a light acid, together with the mat following that to allow people to dry their feet so that there's not a work health and safety issue. There are very few suppliers. It's not something you'd go down to your local hardware shop and buy, and so the team worked quickly to identify the right materials and to have them in place.
So when did the Minister Watt, first request that the mats be rolled out?
We'll just check on the precise date. There was obviously, as you'd be aware, a public discussion about whether more needed to be done to deal with people returning from Indonesia, and particularly Bali, who may have soil on their shoes or on their clothing. Notwithstanding the fact that there is significant signage and other reminders about the need for clean shoes and equipment, golf clubs is another vector, and of course the incoming passenger card asks a very direct question, a legal question that people have to legally attest to that they have not got soil with them. So there was a public discussion about that issue.
Well, while waiting for that info, maybe it might be the benefit of the committee if you outline the measures that the government has taken to address the foot and mouth disease.
We certainly are happy to do that, Senator, so if you'd like us to sort of go through that in more detail.
Do you want to go through that now while we're waiting for the other information?
Okay.
Or is it still Mr Hunter?
It could probably be a very long answer. We will, in our written submission...
Maybe table that for us.
In our written submission, we'll provide full detail, but of course there have been measures taken in Indonesia, there have been measures taken at our border, and there have been measures taken post-border, particularly through the work that we've done with the states and territories and industry associations. But it is a very comprehensive response because, as I said in my opening statement, we are far complacent. We fully understand the implications, and we are looking at all possible ways to reduce risk.
Can you also talk through the process of deploying the foot mats, so not just procurement, but also the deployment?
Yep. I think Mr Hunter can probably answer that now.
So when you say deployment, Senator...
sourcing, I guess,
yep.
And then once you've got them, how long does it take for you to actually get them out to the airports?
So because they were the deployment of the foot mats was made under a determination under the Biosecurity Act, we of course consulted and engaged with all airport operators around that. So we're talking about international airports that receive direct flights from Indonesia. The determination is specific to that. So my people at all of those airport locations engaged with those airport operators, and indeed myself in the case of Melbourne. We assessed with the airport operators exactly where those flights arrive from, so on what aero bridges the Bali and Indonesian flights normally would arrive. We then worked with the airport operator to deploy those mats in a safe way. And as the Secretary has indicated, it's not just the mats with the citric acid solution on it, it's an underfelt mat, so it requires quite a long runway because you want to be able to dry the people off before they hit tiles or carpets or other things. So it was done in full consultation and full collaboration, I have to say, with airport operators around Australia, very successfully by my people. So the mats are not used when there are no flights from Indonesia or Bali. They are tents are barriered off. There have been some scenarios where people have said that they've seen the mats not in use. The mats are always in use where there is an Indonesian or Bali flight operating on the various aero bridges at those airports around Australia.
All right, and do we have information to my earlier question?
We'll certainly provide you with full information. Some of that additional contractor workforce that we've brought on board, Senator, is to assist us with the actual physical deployment and sort of use and topping up of the mats, etc. So.
All right. Now, I just also wanted to ask, with the when was Biosecurity Australia, the department and the chief vet first made aware of the foot and mouth disease outbreak in Indonesia?
Senator, we became aware of reports that foot and mouth disease was in Indonesia on the 6th of May. That was through informal sources at the time. At that time, the Australian Chief Veterinary Officer, Dr. Mark Shipp, notified the Secretary and other executive, the Minister's Office, as well as members of Animal Health Committee, so that's the Chief Veterinary Officers of the states and territories, NBC and also peak industry bodies. Indonesia then went on to officially notify through the World Organisation of Animal Health on the 9th of May.
Okay, so before the 9th of May, it's fair to say we did know about the outbreak?
It was sort of informal in that there were sort of reports coming to us, but they were not officially verified by the Indonesian authorities, which is a key trigger in terms of sort of world animal health response arrangements. It is fair to say, Senator, just to add to Dr Cookson's answer, we're always on high alert for exotic animal diseases. African swine fever is another disease of great concern to us, and it, of course, is present in PNG as well as other key trading partners, particularly China. And that's been a focus for some time. But lumpy skin disease, of course, had come into Indonesia a couple of months prior to that, moving across from Malaysia. And so our system was already on very high alert because of lumpy skin disease, and the foot and mouth disease reports sort of added to our knowledge and concern as to what was happening in terms of those diseases coming into Indonesia.
Can you remind me when the Minister went to Bali to talk to the Indonesians?
Minister Watt was there in July.
The 13th to the 15th of July.
Okay, so, and then soon after he's ordered or requested that mats be installed, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Was any advice given to the previous minister about ordinary mats or the installation of those mats in light of the FMD outbreak?
No, there wasn't. Of course, effectively, our heightened focus on Indonesia commenced with lumpy skin disease being reported, and there were very regular updates to the previous minister at his request, and the department would do that in any event. And of course, a range of measures included in the March budget associated with a response to that. Part of that was because lumpy skin disease can enter through natural pathways, as I'm sure you're aware, insect-borne pathways, as opposed to simply being brought in through passages or through mail or other items.
So just on that point, then what date did the department make the former minister aware of the FMD outbreak in Indonesia?
So jumping to FMD, when was the minister advised about that? So,
The minister was advised on the 6th of May, on the date that the Australian Chief Veterinary Officer received the informal notification that foot and mouth disease had been investigated in Indonesia.
Mr Metcalfe, you made a comment about regular updates.
Senator Ciccone, I'll just get you to finish up with this question.
Thanks,
sir.
Matt.
Yes, I'll get the acting chief vet to talk about the frequency of updates. But just to respond to your original question about foot mats, there was no activity in relation to foot mats until the Minister Watt became minister.
So in terms of the frequency of updates, the minister was advised on the 6th of May. Daily updates to the minister's office commenced from the 9th of May and continued at a frequent basis after that point. There were several times where the Australian Chief Vet met in person with the minister. So the first of those in direct relation to foot and mouth disease was the 2nd of June. That was after the Australian Chief Veterinary Officer returned from Indonesia. I also briefed Minister Watt on the 6th of June. I had travelled with the Australian Chief Veterinary Officer to Indonesia and provided further briefing on the outcomes of that visit. At that time, there has been regular briefings since then, and obviously daily activity around our foot and mouth disease response.
And just to very quickly add to that, the initial report, of course, came in when we were in the caretaker period, and at the request of the former minister, the opposition spokesperson at the time was briefed at the manner as was appropriate, given we were in caretaker. And as you would expect, a significant component of the department's incoming government briefing to the incoming minister dealt with biosecurity and particularly this matter.
Thank you. I'll come back when
Thank
later
you,
on.
Senator Ciccone. Yep,
you,
I'll
Chair.
give you another go. Senator McDonald.
Good morning. Thank you all for presenting this morning. I want to start with just an understanding of this point to follow on from Senator Ciccone. What percentage risk did you rate Indonesia as once you understood there was an outbreak in Indonesia, as opposed to when you discovered the outbreak in Bali?
Senator, I believe you are referring to the structured expert judgment probabilities that have been widely reported. So that is a process that's undertaken by the Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis and uses a structured expert judgment approach. So prior to the outbreak in Indonesia, that exercise, based on the opinion of a range of experts, had placed the probability of a foot and mouth disease outbreak in Australia at 9%. We repeated that expert judgment process once foot and mouth disease had been confirmed in Indonesia, and that probability was raised to 11.6% based on the expert opinion at the time. During that exercise, experts took into account that the disease, the foot and mouth disease, would likely continue to spread within Indonesia, and so it was not repeated once the disease reached Bali, because that had already been taken into account by the experts during that discussion that they held in June 2022.
So my understanding was the risk profile changed with the entry into Bali because of the number of tourists, because of the nature of the tourists, because of the nature of the contact in Bali. I've been advised that 25% of the Australian tourists who go to Bali stay in private residences, often within paddy fields or in close proximity to animals. They're on scooters in mud that's had buffalo wallows, that the risk profile should have changed with the advent of incursion into Bali. Am I not correct, or am I? Yeah, could you explain that further?
I might just start by saying that the structured expert judgment, the 11.6% that's been talked about, is one tool in trying to characterise a changing threat profile. So, of course, there's a range of other factors that are taken into consideration around the border measures, and so complementary measures were put in place as the profile changed within the region. So I might just see if colleagues have anything else to add to that response.
Senator, it's Chris Parker. Dr. Cookson describes one element of risk and the measurement of risk. The important component, I think, as I said at the private briefing, is the increase from 9 to 11.6 rather than the absolute figures. It is not the only thing that we consider when we're looking at it. And if you look at what occurred when it was in Indonesia, before it got to Bali, there was a step up in border measures then. Then when it got to Bali, recognising, as you've quite rightly pointed out, that there's a significant number of tourists going in and out of Bali, particularly from Australia, the measures were stepped up again. And that's in response not just to the increasing structured expert judgment, but the expert judgment of the department and departmental officials who look at what is the risk, what are the likely contributors to that risk, and how we might mitigate that risk. And that's why you saw a step up in border measures at each of those occasions.
All right. So just keeping in mind that, my interest is understanding for Australian farmers and dairy operators and butchers and transport operators, they are expecting, I think we'll all be surprised to understand that risk setting, appreciating everything else you've said, didn't change, because I would have thought that was the key part with the introduction into Bali, and that's the part we are really trying to understand is what's the risk to incursion in Australia.
So, Senator, I didn't say it hadn't changed. I simply said that the 11.6 The 9 to 11.6 was one of the tools. It is a structured expert judgment. It isn't modelling. It's a tool that we use to look at what risk might be. There are a number of other factors that contribute to that risk. And like you, I spend every waking hour looking to protect those butchers, those farmers, those truckies who I'm speaking to on Friday. Every single hour we spend looking after that in the same manner that you do, I know.
Yeah, and to be clear, this is all of my questions are not a criticism or an attack on the department. I know that you're working very hard and to your fullest resourced extent. So please take my questions within that understanding. So if we've identified that the incursion of foot and mouth into the UK was through an airline food trade, that it has been identified that food coming into Australia is our biggest risk of getting foot and mouth disease and African swine fever into Australia. Why have we not yet banned all food coming into Australia in the way that they do in New Zealand and the Northern Territory? You know, just make it very easy for people. It just doesn't come in here.
Senator, we'll just ask Dr Robin Martin, who's the Head of Biosecurity Animal Division, who undertakes that work, to come to the table.
Senator Robin Martin, First Assistant Secretary of Biosecurity Animal Division. Airline food, or any food from the airline, and Mr Hunter can correct me if I'm, that is disposed of as quarantinable waste. With travellers, generally all meat products are not permitted, so uncooked meat, cooked like meatballs, ham, salamis, those things are not permitted. There are a few very highly processed meat products that are permitted, and they're things like canned, retorted products, so that inactivates any viruses of concern. There's, I think, meat flavours where there's no discernible meat is permitted, pork crackling, but things like meat jerky is only permitted from FMD-free countries. Pork jerky is not permitted. So there's very little, but we are reviewing those few items that are currently permitted under our goods determination.
I understood that we have banned the import of the little UHT milk containers that came from Indonesia. So now we're talking about dairy products. Am I correct in that understanding?
So I was talking about products that can come through with travellers. So there's also obviously commercial imports. And so when Indonesia's disease...
and I'm sorry to interrupt you because I will only have a few minutes left, and I appreciate perhaps on notice you would table those lists of food products that are able to be bought in either commercially or through travellers. I guess though it just returns me again to my question. If we've identified that food products coming with travellers is the high risk, that's why we're doing the 100% scanning of post products. That's why we've banned dairy products commercially. Why are we not just making it very easy for our biosecurity officers and saying there is no food? You will not go hungry in Australia. You just can't bring anything in.
Well, Senator, as I said, most, certainly with meat products, are not permitted, and you do have to declare those. And if you don't, as recently happened, then you can have a heavy fine. There are a few very highly processed products that are permitted for personal use, and we're reviewing those.
So may I ask that list be a very urgent list of what is allowed? Because again, food has been identified through all the hearings I've been to as the most likely import risk of FMD and ASF. So I'm just seeking a sense of urgency on all food being banned, or at least identifying a very good reason why you would not be banning everything that comes in with personal use.
And Senator,
I'll
just
just
to...
get my next...
Senator, just to very quickly respond, you're absolutely right. That is something that is constantly under review. There have been significant actions taken in relation to food being imported from Indonesia since the outbreak occurred, and many more categories of food unable to be imported. But the point you make is a good one, and we are constantly reviewing the risk factors associated with any food imports and making changes accordingly. So.
Can I just turn to the budget?
Sorry, Senator McDonald, we might have to, sorry, your time is up. I'm sorry to be strict, but I will keep going around.
Could I just finish this one question and ask?
One more, that's it.
Thank you. I appreciate your patience. So we've spoken about budget measures, including the additional $10 million that was announced recently, the National Biosecurity Strategy, the funding around that. Can I assume that all of these were budget measures that were in place under the previous government that are being carried forward by this new government, and that have there been additional allocations made yet?
Senator, it's Chris Parker. There are a number of announcements in the March budget from the previous government. My understanding was there were no appropriation bills passed to actually give effect to that. The new government, as you would expect, came in and is looking at a whole range of those. We were the minister announced $14 million, which was brought forward from any October process to provide the resources we asked for in regard to both Mr Hunter's activities at the border, activities pre-border with Indonesia, and activities with state colleagues in regard to measures to ensure that the disease does not come in. So that money has been brought forward, and it's not appropriate for me to talk about further budget processes. And then yesterday, I think at the Press Club, the Minister announced an additional $10 million to be provided through Indonesia through our colleagues at DFAT through the overseas aid budget, all of which will go towards ensuring that we support Indonesia in their endeavours to get this disease under control.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Can I just ask one follow-up on Senator McDonald's questions? I thought I read somewhere that there were concerns in a review, might have been the Inspector General or even the Matthews review, I just can't recall, that maybe we do let too many milk products in. Is that something that anyone's aware of, and is milk in particular or milk dairy products being looked at as a potential pathway and a risk?
Senator Sir Robin Martin. With commercial imports, so when Indonesia notified that it had lumpy skin disease, then those products, unless they were treated to an extent that the virus was no longer of concern, those permits were suspended or revoked. And then there were a couple of remaining dairy type products which have been suspended or revoked when foot and mouth disease was notified. So we have very strict import requirements for meat and meat products and dairy, and it very much depends on your country disease status. And if you aren't free of certain diseases, then it means the product has to be very highly processed to ensure that those viruses of concern are inactivated.
Okay, thank you. I'm probably captured by Senator McDonald's question, but if you could specifically make sure you include there on that list the remaining dairy products that can come from FMD countries. Senator White.
Thanks, Chair. My questions are for DFAT. Mr Ferguson, what support is DFAT providing through overseas development assistance or any other mechanism to help Tunisia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea address animal health issues such as FMD and lumpy skin disease?
Thanks very much, Senator. I might start on Indonesia, if that's all right, and just say, look, the support DFAT provides is threefold. First and foremost, we work very, very closely with agencies at Post, particularly our DAF colleagues, in terms of monitoring and responding to the outbreak. We have high-level engagement, and the ambassador in Indonesia has been particularly active in engaging across the Indonesian system because, of course, any assistance we give must be working very, very closely with the Indonesian government for things like vaccines or permits are required. So we need to make sure that we are actually responding to the needs of the Indonesian government and that we are providing assistance that is actually sought and will be welcomed by the Indonesian government. Thirdly, a number of my colleagues have already mentioned the $10 million package announced yesterday. This and the previous vaccines, which were announced on the 14th of July, will be rolled out through our development program. We have very well-established programs such as the Australia-Indonesia Health Security Initiative, partnership, and through this we're able to leverage very experienced contractors, their networks in the Indonesian system, and the relationships of trust they've built up to implement that. So those vaccines will be purchased and will be imported into Indonesia through that security initiative, as they were during COVID. You also asked about Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea. Again, we'll be working very, very closely with DAF, and my colleague, Acting Chief Veterinary Officer, had recently went to Timor-Leste to do assessments. At the moment in Timor-Leste and PNG, as we've heard, there are no active cases of FMD yet. Hopefully won't be, but we are working closely with DAF and with host governments to do needs analysis and to provide technical assistance and to prepare for assistance if required.
Thank you. Can I talk about what the effect, ask a couple of questions about the effect on our industries of these outbreaks? This might be a question, I think, for Ms. Follett. Will an outbreak of FMD in Australia lead to the banning of all imports of Australian meat and meat products into major markets?
Thank you, Senator. Look, there's certainly that possibility that initially, if FMD were to come into Australia, there would certainly be an impact, a significant impact on our exports. The Department of Agriculture, Forestries and Fisheries is the lead on this particular issue, and we work closely with them. But I imagine they would have something further to add on that. Following the conclusion of my response to you, I would say that following any ban, though, there would be the opportunity, I think, to work through the usual processes to try and re-establish market access. But I would defer to my DAF colleagues.
Yes, Senator, it's Andrew Metcalfe. I'll ask my colleague Nicola Hinder, who's head of our Exports Division, to complete that answer.
Thank you very much, Senator. Nicola Hinder, First Assistant Secretary of the Exports and Veterinary Services Division. Foot and mouth disease is characterised, I think, as being the big bang of animal diseases. It will have an immediate impact on our exports into a wide variety of markets. I will note, though, that Australia's ability to be an excellent exporter of agricultural goods has been built upon an exemplary biosecurity record. The reason why we are able to enjoy such wide and variety market access into a huge amount of markets for dairy products, for our meat and animal products, and our live animal exports is because we are free of emergency animal diseases such as foot and mouth disease. Upon notification, for instance, that Australia did have a case of foot and mouth disease or indeed lumpy skin disease, there would be notification to the World Organisation for Animal Health that we have a detection. That would then trigger a range of actions both within Australia and also by trading partners to be able to suspend trade. As Ms Follett said, there will be opportunities depending upon the animal disease that's detected. Lumpy skin disease, for instance, we might be able to do preemptive negotiations with some trading partners. With foot and mouth disease, obviously the consequences on trade would be much more significant. We would need to be in a situation of having either the disease under control in a defined area and then commence negotiations with trading partners in order for exports to be able to recommence.
So can I just clarify, it definitely will affect meat and meat products into markets. Does it also affect other non-meat products like dairy and wool?
Absolutely, Senator. So foot and mouth disease, with the wide variety of animals that it does affect, we would see an effect on our meat and meat trade that not only includes bovine animals, but of course ovine and caprine. We would also see a cessation of trade in things like rendered products, dairy products, hides and skins. Wool would also potentially be affected depending upon trading conditions, etc. So the impact of FMD, particularly on animal-based export products, would be significant.
So, okay, so it would be limited just to those animals that could be affected? Is that the test, or is it wider than that?
Well, Senator, sometimes what's forgotten as well through a trade negotiation is that it is actually a negotiation between two partners. Australia has to be able to prove its credentials to be able to export to trading partners. Trading partners set conditions over those exports. So undoubtedly, we would only expect to see impacts on animals that are caught up in the FMD incursion. But irrespective, we would still need to be able to provide the veracity of our exports to our trading partners.
Senator, I might just add to that. Australia, probably along with New Zealand, has got the most stringent biosecurity requirements in relation to imports into Australia, which is a way of us protecting our animal and related industries. But should the worst happen, and we had an incursion of that nature in Australia, then it would be reasonable to expect that other countries would impose similar conditions upon us. Trade is very much a two-way thing, and quarantine arrangements are very much an area where countries look at what the other is doing. So we have been successful in ensuring that these diseases do not get to Australia for over a century and a half with FMD. It is an area of incredible focus, a huge focus for us because we understand how important this is. But at the same time, should the worst happen, then we can expect it would have significant trade implications in terms of our ability to export.
Thank you. That's a good segue into my next question. What action has been taken by DFAT to manage potential trade restrictions imposed by trading partners?
Again, Senator, I might suggest that the Department of Agriculture picks that up, because that is our sort of core responsibility.
So, Senator, it would depend upon the nature of the disease that you're actually referring to. So I would characterise the efforts that we have taken in terms of trade preparedness to be exceptionally high. What we have done for both lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease is to do an in-depth review of all of the trade conditions that we are required to provide certification to a trading partner, so that we have confidence, for instance, that our ability to trade may or may not be affected through a detection. It's probably best as well if I give you an overview as to the way that the trade occurs. So exports from Australia, particularly for animal and animal products, must be accompanied by an export health certificate. On that export health certificate, it has the sanitary conditions which we've negotiated with a trading partner to be able to demonstrate that we are meeting their trade requirements. There are some countries that that require disease attestations on those certificates, and some of those attestations could go to freedom from disease. So Australia would be required to certify that we are free of either lumpy skin disease to be able to export products to some markets, or alternatively free from foot and mouth disease. But just because it's on the certificate does not mean that a trading partner may or may not change their import requirements depending on how and when Australia notifies a disease. So just because there's nothing on the certificate that indicates that freedom from that particular disease is required,
a trading partner, upon time of Australia notifying that we have a disease, could impose a trade imposition to be able to prevent the exports from that country. And again, Senator, I note that that is in line with Australia's current biosecurity requirements as well, where we also take notifications that have happened to the World Organisation of Animal Health to be able to determine whether or not it's satisfying our own risks to be able to accept imports.
And Senator, it's for that reason of our concern to protect Australia's markets and therefore the incomes of Australian animal product producers, graziers and pastoralists and others, given that about 70% of our animal products are exported, that we have been constantly reiterating through the last period that Australia is free of foot and mouth disease, Australia is free of lumpy skin disease, Australia is free of African swine fever, and we have the most stringent arrangements in the world to prevent them from coming into the country. The mere public discussion about the possibility of these diseases coming into Australia has led to some trading partners questioning whether Australia is just accepting that they may come and potentially impacting on our markets. So we have really been working overtime to reassure our trading partners that we are free from these diseases and that we are doing everything reasonably possible to prevent them from coming into Australia.
And
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Senator White. Thanks, Senator White. At the same time, of course, we need to hope for the best and prepare for the worst, and that's why it's very important that we do get everything in train. Thank you, Senator White. We'll go to Senator Colbeck.
Thanks, Chair. Look, just a couple of follow-up questions from the briefing we had last week in relation to FMD countries. You've given us a list of countries that have FMD present or are regarded by the IOE as having FMD. Do we have a list of, or is there a difference between having FMD present and an FMD outbreak and a notification process? Is there a difference in those two things?
I might take that one, Secretary. Senator, there is a process within the World Organisation for Animal Health where countries either officially report their status, and so that's the list of the 68 countries noted that foot and mouth disease was present. When a status changes, so when it's the reoccurrence of a disease or a change in the distribution of a disease, then countries are required to also report those changes. So they will be reported for the period of the last 12 months. And that's where you will see some differences in how those countries are reporting to the World Organisation for Animal Health.
So a country might be regarded as having FMD, but there's a requirement to report if they have an active outbreak.
There's a requirement to report if it's a substantial change to their current status. So that, for example, would be when they've been regarded as being having foot and mouth disease, for example, contained to a zone, and the disease may be reported outside of that zone. They would then report that change in distribution to the World Organisation for Animal Health. On a routine basis, if the disease is endemic, you may find that there will be some smaller outbreaks of disease, but if it's within an area that's already been confirmed to have the disease, that won't necessarily be reported to the World Organisation for Animal Health.
So the outbreak in Indonesia is effectively a significant change in the activity of the disease in that jurisdiction? That's
correct, Senator. Indonesia had previously been officially recognised by the World Organisation for Animal Health as FMD-free. So when FMD was detected within Indonesia, they then had to notify the World Organisation of Animal Health of that change.
So the UK is not on that list at the moment, so they are regarded as FMD-free following their outbreak in the early 2000s and having eradicated it?
Yes, that's correct, Senator.
Okay. Can we get a list of significant changes over, say, the last decade in notifications? Is it possible to pull it together, please?
Yes, we can take that on notice.
Okay, now, and I'm happy with that. Has Senator Watt been to Indonesia twice this year or just once?
Just once, Senator. So,
Okay, thank you.
in July. Minister Littleproud was there in January, and Minister Watt went there soon after he was sworn in.
And sorry, Senator, the Prime Minister was there on the 6th of June as well?
That's correct. Yep.
Well, I thought I saw, and this is just a memory thing, Senator Watt with the Prime Minister on his initial visit, and he's subsequently done a special visit for discussions with FMD. So I saw the wrong person.
Yeah, for sure. No, Minister Watt wasn't with the Prime Minister when the PM went very early on. The matter of FMD was discussed between the Prime Minister and the President, and Minister Watt then visited subsequently.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Coming off unmute. Thank you, Senator Colbeck. I've just got a couple of questions. First of all, just on how we detect or how we measure viral fragments. With the pork loss incident in Melbourne recently, just wondering how did the Minister and others know that there were no viral fragments in that? I've been told that to determine whether there are viral fragments, you have to do a process called virus isolation. And apparently, I'm told that no lab in Australia is approved or authorised to do that, although apparently in Geelong we could do it, but apparently not authorised to do it. That's the information I have at least. So how did we know that if we don't have a facility here in Australia to do this, or was this sent overseas to do?
Senator Robin Martin. So the test detects viral fragments. So what we have said is that it doesn't detect live virus. So you are correct in that to detect live virus, you have to try and grow the virus on cell culture. And often that won't work. We've tried that with African swine fever, with the detection that we've had on a significant number of products, at times of products seized at the border, 40% or 48% have tested positive for ASF. So, so any virus, it's the viral fragments. With the pork floss, that product was a product that had been apparently mislabelled. And so that matter is under investigation. It was shelf stable. It was sitting on the shelf, so it had been highly processed. We do currently allow imports of pork floss commercially with an import permit, but it has to be heat treated to a certain time temperature. And because we didn't have those records for that product has been removed from the shelves.
Robin, can you tell us which laboratory was able to detect the viral fragments?
Yeah, so for all exotic animal diseases, samples are sent to the Australian Centre of Disease Preparedness, so that's CSIRO in Geelong.
That's Geelong. This is the Geelong laboratory, is that right?
That's right.
Yep. Okay. Did they do the virus isolation process as such, or they conducted other tests that got you confidence there was no virus there?
Senator, that once they detect FMD viral fragments, that product's destroyed. So I think what we've said is that the test detects viral fragments, not live virus. And as I've explained, because this product was something that had been heat process, was shelf stable, then it would be very unlikely that it would have live virus. Because anything that's sitting on a shelf that doesn't spoil, we know that it's been highly heat treated. But we didn't have the documentation, and so that's currently under investigation.
Senator Siro, of course, are appearing after us today, so I'm sure they'll be able to talk about this in detail. Sorry, Senator, we can't hear you.
You would think I'd get the habit of this. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
A couple of other quick questions from me. How is Indonesia recording which animals have been identified? Which animals have been vaccinated?
Senator, Indonesia, as far as I'm aware, had been identifying animals predominantly through, having a visual identification placed on the animals, not necessarily a permanent identification. Livestock identification has been one of the priority areas that Indonesia has raised with the Australian government for support with, and there's been some initial discussions about what that might look like.
So it's not an ear tag as such? I've been told it's just a ribbon potentially. Is that what's happening?
It depends, I think, on whether it's a smallholder. So yes, in some cases, the smallholders, I believe, are using like a necklace type of identification. Animals that are held in the more commercial feedlots would have a different system of identification.
Now, I'm just going to ask, I'll have to do this quickly because I do want to stick to time. I'm using up Senator Colbeck's time. But I do have questions about the Matthews review. I know that was some time ago, but after reading it, I'm not convinced that we have made progress in some areas. In particular, the Matthews review seemed to identify that we really don't have the resources if there were an outbreak to go through the disease eradication. Indeed, a quote here from Mr Matthews is the team's assessment is that because an FMD outbreak could be at least an order of magnitude more demanding than any previous animal disease outbreak, state, national and industry resources could quickly be overwhelmed. I mean, my estimate here and my perception is that in the last decade or so since this report, we've got fewer extension officers at the state level. Do we have the resources? Have we done an audit on have we got the people on the ground to take charge of the destruction, the restrictions on movement necessary to control an outbreak?
Senator, you're asking how long's a piece of string, but let me just take a step back. I think we've clearly recognised that there is a range of services that are going to be required in an outbreak situation. The Secretary appointed me to my role for exactly that reason. When it became increasingly obvious that there would be even more requirements, the Secretary announced an increasing focus across the department, and the Minister recently announced a joint task force between DAF and EMA to address exactly the issues you are raising and to work through with emergency services, with health departments, with a whole range of people and come up with a plan within the next month about what that looks like and where there are gaps. So I think that you raise a very good point, and it is something that the government through the Minister was very focused on, and it is something that we're very focused on, recognising that we can manage the biology, if you like, or the biosecurity component, but just, for example, in a simple stock standstill, which would be the first thing that would occur, you would need significant resources from the police and emergency services to be able to help in ensuring that that's able to be enforced. So it's definitely an issue and definitely something we're focused on and definitely something the government's focused on.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Senator, I'll just very quickly add that it's a very good point. This was, you may be aware from media reports that all agriculture ministers around Australia met 2 or 3 weeks ago now. This was a major area of focus for them. And indeed, I think pretty well every state is now looking at its own preparedness arrangements. We do have the AusVet plan and other sort of well-documented sort of escalation procedures, but the reason that Minister Watt set up this task force was precisely to answer the question and to engage with the states and territories for the reasons that you've outlined.
Thank you for that. Could you take on notice how many extension officers, for want of a better word, we have across the country, across state, territory and federal governments? Is that something
we would need to ask each jurisdiction? Yeah, we'd need to ask each jurisdiction to assist us with that, Senator.
Well, if you could take on notice, I think it would be a worthwhile order to have, even if you can't release it to us. Would be good.
I imagine
I'll leave that with you.
Yeah, the task force that's working on this will be sort of engaged in that sort of activity. So we'll certainly do our best to provide you with the best information. Okay. But but is very
Thank you,
much that
Secretary.
that area of sort of on-the-ground response, as we saw with the human pandemic, with COVID, is where the states actually have the lead responsibility, and the Commonwealth's role is support, coordination and quite often funding. So.
And if I
Thank you,
might
Secretary.
add
Now,
to
just
that-
some housekeeping. We're going to try and finish foot and mouth disease, if that's possible. We do have, I think, another 3 senators, so we'll restrict that to half an hour at max. We'll have a short break and then come back for Varroa mite. Going to Senator Roberts now.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for attending today. Can you hear me?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Mr Metcalfe. A high-level strategy seems to be to stop the spread of foot and mouth disease in Bali, and that's particularly concerning because it could go to other Indonesian islands. But then once it's stopped in Bali, to eradicate it in Bali, and then to prevent it getting into Australia at the same time. And then if it arrives into Australia, and heaven forbid that, then contain it in Australia. Is that correct?
It's a multi-pronged approach. Yeah, certainly, Senator. It's a multi-pronged approach. We are obviously working very hard to support Indonesia. It's a very important friend and neighbour of ours, and obviously their own domestic food security is a key issue for them. And of course, it's a very important market for Australian cattle as well. So there is a lot of work being done in Indonesia, particularly focused in Bali, because that obviously has great significance for Indonesia as a major tourism destination as well. But we are very much focused on ensuring that there's no ability for the virus to enter Australia through any of the pathways that exist through passenger movement, through cargo, through imports, through mail systems, etc. And then,
okay, thank you for that.
And then prudently, we are then planning for what if the worst happened, and that's exactly the point that Senator Canavan was exploring just then.
Yes, and it's true that if foot and mouth disease spreads to Australia, there'll be a high probability that vaccines will be required at the 48-hour mark, as per the AusVet plan, correct?
Senator, no, that's not correct. I think that there is a range of strategies that may be implemented depending on the scenario. Vaccines, if we look back in the UK situation, particularly in 2007, they chose not to use vaccines. If you don't use vaccines, you have a much better chance of getting back into markets quicker. So it becomes a decision based on expert advice, and there are structures in place for that expert advice to be provided, and that expert advice would guide the strategy that would be used depending on the scenario.
Under what scenario? Thank you for that. That's good clarification, very useful. Under what scenarios would we use vaccines?
Again, a widespread outbreak in a number of different states could well necessitate the use of vaccines.
Okay, thank you.
Senator, sorry, I can just add that there's been some modelling done. So, and I think some of that work's published, so if that is, we'll provide that. But for very intense agriculture areas, so where a lot of cattle are together, then vaccination was shown to be effective at getting the outbreak under control in a quicker period of time versus more extensive situations. So, more, I guess, Queensland and Northern Territory, where animals are far greater distributed, then vaccination was not so successful. I think what you were referring to before is that the committee that would look at the technical committee, which is made of CVOs, the chief vets, would look at ordering vaccine immediately the virus was typed, that we knew. We may not use it, but the intent would be to order it straight away so that we have it here.
Thank you for that. I appreciate both your answers. Do we know the strain of foot and mouth disease in Bali? Has it been typed?
Yes, Senator, we do. It's a strain of the serotype O variety.
Okay, thank you. If we know the strain, which we do, and we accept the high probability of needing vaccines in certain areas of Australia, why are we not making vaccines available both for Australia and for Indonesia?
We wouldn't be using vaccine in Australia, and probably the easiest way to look at this is from a trade perspective. In its broadest sense, the world's divided into sort of three groups. Those who have FMD, who have quite restricted trade access. Those who don't have FMD but are classified as free of FMD with vaccination, they have a little more access. And then, of course, there are countries like Australia which are free of FMD completely without vaccination, and they have almost unfettered access to most markets on that basis. So if we were to use FMD vaccine in Australia, we would change our trading status, and that would restrict us in a number of markets around the world.
Thank you for that answer. I'm not advocating the use of vaccines. I'm suggesting that in response to the previous witness's statement, Linda, I think her name is, I'm sorry, I don't know her second name, said that vaccines would be used if there's a widespread outbreak and and areas with intense agriculture with high density of cattle.
Yeah, I think the point you were trying to make, if I'm right, Senator, is given that we know the strain in barley, would it be prudent to pre-position vaccine here in Australia to be used if necessary? So,
well, we have pre-positioned vaccine in a vaccine bank in the UK that can be provided to the country within 7 days.
So my understanding is that you're correct on that 7 days, but if they were stored in Australia, then there would be access within 48 hours.
If it was stored in Australia, yes, we would have quicker access than that 7 days. We would need to ensure that it's the correct serotype. We've made an assumption, if you like, that the most likely serotype is to get in from Indonesia. That's not an assumption that I've made or we've made in essence. That's you've articulated that scenario. The vaccine would last for a period of time and then have to either be provided to another country for quick use or would simply be no longer of any use. So the scenario you describe is accurate, but it would take a wide range of negotiations and discussions around whether we'd even keep vaccine in Australia for that purpose.
So do any of the vaccines in storage in the United Kingdom match the strain in barley?
We don't usually talk about all the various strains we have in the bank, but I think I have said publicly that we do have that strain in our bank and we do have access to 1 million doses.
A million doses in Australia would be many millions of dollars, but it would seem petty cash compared with the cost to our industry if foot and mouth disease came here. Some people have estimated, with credibility, $80 billion.
Well, ABARES, which is part of our department, has estimated that that's a 10-year likely cost across the economy should we have a widespread outbreak in Australia. Senator, what I think our colleagues have said here this morning is that there are extremely well-developed plans should there be a possible detection in Australia, including through the ability to access the correct type of vaccine from the United Kingdom at very short notice. But should the decision be taken to vaccinate Australian animals, that would have a devastating impact on our ability to trade as well. It would place us back into that category that Dr. Parker indicated that would significantly restrict our ability to trade. So the decision to vaccinate is a very, very big decision because it has a very big trade implication, and there are other measures that can be taken as provided for in the AusVet plan that fall short of vaccination.
I appreciate that. Thank you for emphasising it. What I'm trying to do is look at the worst case scenario, and I'm guessing the worst case scenario, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if foot and mouth disease entered Australia and then infested our feral animals and then spread quickly. Is that correct?
That's one scenario.
Yeah, is that the worst? What's the worst then?
The worst is it getting in at all. That's the worst scenario, that it gets in at all. And that's
I would have thought that had it entered Australia and been contained, that would not be as bad as getting into Australia and not being contained.
Yes, that's correct, Senator. Dr Martin referred earlier to some modelling that has been done, and there's certainly some scenarios where we would predict that the disease may be harder to contain. That scenario is largely based around where intensive livestock industries are based in close proximity to one another, and where environmental factors are more conducive to the virus surviving. So under those scenarios, we may see, based on the predictions of the model, of course, more widescale spread. The question of feral animals, of course, there are some susceptible species in Australia that are feral. The experience overseas is that there is less known about the role that they would have in the ongoing transmission of the virus. Certainly the experience overseas has been that if you can control the disease in the livestock species, that tends to be the primary objective of the control.
Thank you very much. Last question, Chair, if I can.
Okay, one more.
Thank you.
Yep.
After we've seen the modelling from the Imperial College in London and the Doherty Institute with regard to human vaccines and the spread of coronavirus or COVID in Australia, I'm just very curious to know who did the modelling for us, and have they modelled all the scenarios, including infestation of feral animals?
We'll take that on notice, Senator, to provide you with that. So,
wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Metcalfe, and thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Roberts. Could I just ask one quick question of clarity on Senator Roberts' line of questioning? I'm just not clear. Would the storage of vaccines, FMD vaccines in Australia itself change our FMD-free status? Just that, not the use of them, just the storage of them per se.
I think I'd have to take that on notice. But
okay, thank you. And have we costed what it would cost to store a variety of vaccines here in Australia?
Chair, based on the question that I asked a moment ago, that the UK are now FMD free based on eradicating it.
That's right.
Storage. I'd be interested in that answer to that question too, because they're not on the list as having FMD.
That's right.
They do have the bank. So I think that almost answers the question.
Yeah, I thought it would too, but the officials have taken on notice. But do you have anything to add?
Thanks very much, Chair. We'll take that on notice. So.
Okay. And just finally, maybe if you take on notice, have you costed? If so, how much would it cost to store vaccines
We'll do our best to respond. So.
Thank you, Secretary. Okay, I'm going to Senator Ciccone.
Thanks a lot, Chair. Just following on from the vaccines, so as soon as the former minister was made aware of the FMD outbreak in Indonesia back in May, did the minister ask your department to order more vaccines?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Did the minister also ask your department to order more foot mats?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
What actions did the former minister take once becoming aware of the FMD outbreak in Indonesia?
This was through the caretaker period, Senator, and of course the Minister was aware of the significant funding that was in the budget, primarily associated with the response to a lumpy skin disease outbreak in Indonesia. But the Minister certainly remained well briefed through that entire period, and as I indicated, provided a briefing to the opposition spokesperson.
Okay, so back to my question: what actions did the Minister take?
We'll need to double check exactly what may have occurred. There was a lot of activity, as you'd expect, right through this period, Senator, so I might take that on notice.
Okay. Just on that caretaker period that you mentioned, Mr Metcalfe, could you just probably explain for probably my benefit and maybe for others on the committee, during the caretaker provisions, what can a minister do?
Well, the government remains the government and is in full possession of its powers. However, there is the convention, of course, that no significant appointments, contracts or other policy matters are progressed without consultation. That does not require agreement, but without consultation with the opposition. So.
Could the Minister have taken action to either raise awareness or address address the risks of FMD?
I've indicated we'll take that on notice, Senator. So there certainly were visits by officials. There was media awareness. There were other activities underway, but I'll need to go back and check, and we'll provide you with a full answer. So.
Did your department provide any advice to the Minister about the actions that should be taken to prevent the FMD outbreak reaching Australia since the initial briefing back in May?
I'll take that on notice, Senator. So.
Did your department have discussions with other departments about the possibility of closing the border with Indonesia?
No, Senator.
So no request had come from a ministerial office asking about the closure of the border?
Not that I'm aware, but for the sake of completeness, we'll go back and check our records.
Okay. So could you just rejig my memory? What date the current minister, Watt, was made aware of the FMD outbreak in Indonesia since being sworn in as minister?
He was made aware on the very first occasion I met him, which was the 1st of June. So.
Okay. Now, one of the recommendations of the Craik Review was the introduction of the biosecurity imports levy. Now, I understand that the implementation of this levy was initially delayed and then abandoned. But then in 2019, then former minister announced a design of an alteration of that levy. Are you able to provide an update for my benefit about where we're up to with that levy?
Certainly, Senator. Some of the sort of earlier progress predates my time. I was appointed to my role on the 1st of February 2020, and that was, I think, the day before we introduced the initial travel bans associated with COVID. In the period after that, because of the very significant impacts that were happening on business, on importers, disruptions to supply chains, the previous government took the view that it was not appropriate at that time to proceed with changes to cost recovery arrangements associated with biosecurity levies. There are, of course, cost recovery arrangements that have been in place and continue in place. What
was not appropriate about the levy?
It was, if you recall, back at that period 2.5 years ago, there was a huge disruption to supply chains, with passenger travel being significantly reduced, almost eliminated for a period because of the human pandemic. We were seeing very significant impact on supply chains through mail and parcel and other areas, and of course many businesses under severe financial distress associated with the human pandemic. The previous minister would have indicated the reasons at the time. I'm sure that's on the public record, but the view was taken by government that it was not appropriate to make any alterations to the existing cost recovery arrangements in the form of sort of a further biosecurity levy. Having said that, the previous government returned to the issue and was, were it still in office, my understanding is that it would have been pursuing again a biosecurity levy. But with the change of government, there of course was an election commitment from the incoming Albanese government that there be reform of cost recovery and biosecurity levy, and that's something the department's obviously working on.
Okay, and as part of that work, would a levy be part of that?
Government hasn't addressed the issue formally yet, so we are obviously working through some options, and we'll be discussing those with the minister. But ultimately, that would be a matter for the budget processes.
Yeah.
So.
And I'm sure you agree that many in the industry have said time and time again that from their point of view, it's very important that we have a sustainable funding mechanism in place to support the great work our biosecurity officers do.
There's a lot of cost recovery already in the system, but there's a view both from the agriculture industry that the biosecurity shouldn't be reliant upon budget appropriations and therefore subject to changes to government priorities, and it should have a sort of ongoing sustainable funding source. At the same time, the industries that pay many of the costs. Importers who are provided services by my department in our regulatory role have indicated that they're keen for reform. They, of course, are regulated and pay fees not only in relation to our work but also the Australian Border Force and others impose fees as well for various activities. The current cost arrangements are quite dated and don't take into account technological and other advances, and so it is an area where we believe some good reform is possible.
So why haven't all the recommendations of the Craik Review been implemented?
Sorry, Senator?
So why haven't all the recommendations of the Craik Review been implemented? It was a fairly comprehensive
I'm not
review.
sure if... unfortunately, our policy division is unwell today, Senator, so I will take that on notice and we'll come back to you on that.
So can I just go back a step? I think, I'm not sure if Dr Cookson or yourself, Secretary, but you mentioned the distinction between informal advice and formal advice around FMD. When was the first time the department was aware of the informal advice?
I think it was the 6th of May.
6th of May, correct. 6th of May.
6th of May.
Last year.
So we were starting to hear, we were hearing through...
So you hadn't heard of the FMD outbreak earlier on?
No.
The first time that you or your officer
6th of
officials
May.
were aware? 6th of May. All right. Okay. Now, as soon as the former minister was advised about the outbreak, did he increase any of the passenger screening at our airports?
There were a number of measures taken across the period from when lumpy skin disease was detected and whatever. We could go back and provide you with some form of chronology as to what occurred.
And if you could also just whether we increased our mail and cargo screening as well too.
We'll take that on notice, Senator.
All right. Well, thank you. I think I might just leave my questions there, Chair, in the interest of time. Any others I might put on the record. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Coney. We'll go to Senator McDonald. Appreciate officials being here for a while. We'll have a short break after Senator McDonald and then come back to Varroa Mike. Senator McDonald.
Thank you very much, Chair, and yes, thank you to the department and officials for waiting on. Just to go back, I put a question on notice with regard to the with the list of foods, but I wanted to add another question on notice, which is around the FMD risk profile and its changes over time. So say over the last 12 months to now for different countries. We've spoken about there being foot and mouth disease in India, I believe Vietnam, now Indonesia, and specifically Bali. I'm keen to understand that mix of risk profiles and for different vectors and pathways, so will feeding, foot traffic and weather. Would that be possible for that to be provided, please, Secretary?
We'll endeavour to give you the most detail that we can, Senator. Whether it's able to be broken down in exactly that way, we'll need to check with our experts, but I'll take that on notice.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Senator Chris Locke. I think in the answer to a couple of the questions we've had, we should provide a more detailed chronology that talked about the step up in measures that happened both with the Indonesia detection and also the Bali detection. We can list those out for you.
Thank you. I'd appreciate that because there seems to be, I think there's a clear understanding that the move from Indonesia to Bali was a real trigger for heightened alertness. And I'm just trying to understand those changing risk profile as well as those other countries where we're already aware.
Yep, for sure. Thanks, Senator. And Dr. Parker sort of outlined that the expert assessment that Dr. Cookson outlined was one of a number of sort of areas that went into the department changing its view of risk and changing advice as to what measures should be in place.
Thank you, Secretary. I want to turn to the vaccines again. I understand that the public sector vaccines from Elanco, Argentina, was sent yesterday and it will arrive on the 16th. And it has been labelled with not for sale. So the private sector is hoping to see vaccinations in early September. Does that sound about right to you?
The date I have is actually the 22nd of August, but happy to take the actual arrival date on notice and notify the Senate when that occurs. There are a range of challenges within the Indonesian system about access for some of the larger private sector players in the marketplace. I know that they have released I think in the order of 60,000 vaccines which had previously been used, and really that's a matter for the Indonesians going forward. But speaking with industry earlier this week, I'm aware that LSD vaccines arrived in Jakarta, that there is now increasing numbers. The Indonesians have appointed 5 different companies to be able to import the vaccine into the country. So I think it would be fair to say there's quite a bit of momentum in this space, Senator.
Oh, that's terrific. I understand that the LEP and MLA offers to fund vaccines for Australian cattle in Indonesia have been well received there. Is that your understanding?
They've been well received by all. I know MLA have are negotiating at the moment, and the final mechanisms that are going to be used are just being worked out, and the same with another vaccine proposal, which is more about assisting feedlots there and also smallholders surrounding feedlots.
Thank you. I understand that some Australian commentary about going into Indonesia to physically provide vaccinations have been met with some concern. Earlier in the outbreak, I understand that DAF utilised some experts from overseas, specifically Israel and other countries. Is that still a project that you're continuing of utilising expertise from around the world where they've had outbreaks of themselves to support the Indonesians in their rollout?
The short answer is yes, but I might ask Dr. Cookson to outline a little more detail, Senator.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Senator, for the question. We have been working very closely with our colleagues in the Australian-Indonesia Health Security Partnership, who already have expertise in this area, and amongst that, drawing in international expertise such as the eminent expert you mentioned from Israel, our vaccine expert advisory group within Australia, who provides technical advice to chief veterinary officers through Animal Health Committee, has also been engaged and provided technical advice to Indonesia on vaccines and on vaccine manufacture. And we are just in we've also contracted one of those experts to provide direct advice to Indonesia on an ongoing basis, and that expert will actually visit Indonesia. That's now been agreed with Indonesia, and that person will be in country within the next, hopefully, week, maybe 2 weeks.
Oh, that's terrific. Can I check, with the task force that was announced last week, is the AusVets engaged in that task force?
Well, Animal Health Australia is involved, Senator. So.
No, specifically, Secretary. Can we? My information is that I'm trying to put this in a sensitive manner. Are we ensuring that AusVets, particularly those who've had experience with outbreaks in other parts of the world, are being engaged at the task force and not represented through another body?
I'm not quite sure. Your delicateness is making the question hard to understand. I'm sorry, Senator. Might I just say that the holders of AusVet plan, if you like, the coordinators of that, are Animal Health Australia, and they are actively involved. I am aware that the task force is up in Darwin on Friday and will be meeting with a range of people. I'm aware that there has been discussions with the National Biosecurity Committee, of which a number of Chief Veterinary Officers from around the states are members. So there is active engagement of the veterinary community, if that's what you're asking. If you're asking are individual veterinary surgeons who have experience either through maybe the Nepal where we sent them there, or whether they had experience in the UK, I don't believe that would be the case. However, we have met with the Australian Veterinary Association just the other day, where some of the issues which I'm sure you're delicately trying to raise, we discussed with them, and there are a range of programs that exist and will be further developed into the future about engagement of private veterinarians in any disease response.
And Senator, if I might add, just to put this in context, so the work of this task force is not to displace the vet plan and the existing response mechanisms. This really came out of, well, a collective understanding, but one which was obvious to us when I and the head of Emergency Management Australia briefed what's called National Coordinating Mechanism on the 22nd of July, and the reference at that committee, which was leads on biosecurity but also emergency response folk, was the bones and the mechanisms of kind of collaboration at a biosecurity technical level were extremely good. But the open questions were what were the handoffs to emergency management services, and that needed to be worked through in some detail. And I spoke to the head of Emergency Management Australia yesterday, and he confirmed that that is indeed the focus of what they're working on, not to replace the current systems, but to work out what happens if these plans are activated at scale.
All right. Well, I guess given the shortness of time today, what I'm hearing on the ground is some of the front line of detection and treatment for lumpy skin or foot and mouth detection will be at a very grassroots level. I've been trying to identify if there's been any work done on providing some very visual aids like posters to go into station lunch rooms so that, young stockmen and women who are riding around would be able to recognise the disease. But at the moment, I can only find big companies doing it for themselves. But I'm very keen to understand how local farmers would be able to, and that's just a very specific example. I don't need to get into that now, but just on the front line, if a farmer detects something that they think is lumpy skin or foot and mouth at this point, do they clearly understand what their go-to is in Australia? And they're telling me no, so I think that's my answer. I don't want to hold us up on that though, because I know the chair will have to move on. I just wanted to come back to vaccines again. You touched on the lumpy skin disease program. I'm interested in understanding how they can be better tied together, because it seems we are vaccinating the herd up there at a greater rate with foot and mouth, but the lumpy skin is slower to get out. And I wonder if you could assist me with if there's any plans to link those vaccination programs together so that animals would be given both vaccinations at once, if that is possible.
Yes, thanks, Senator. I might need to take on notice the precise technical advice that's been provided on that. Certainly, the Australian government has provided 435,000 doses of the lumpy skin disease vaccine earlier after the outbreak was announced in Indonesia. And there have been several discussions that I'm aware of about linking those vaccination programs. Understandably, the Indonesian government is very focused on the foot and mouth disease outbreak, given how rapidly it has spread through the population. But I was aware that through the Australian-Indonesia Health Security Partnership, further technical advice was being sought about the effect of administering both vaccines. So I'll take that on notice and provide a more current response.
And Senator, just on the earlier point you raised about sort of awareness down at the stockhand level and whatever, I can advise that we have, of course, as you know, a whole series of on-plant vets in meat establishments. They've recently been trained to recognise any possible symptoms, but down at the property level, I met recently with the head of the Red Meat Advisory Council, and he was detailing a whole range of activities that are underway, at the business level, at the property level, in relation to that sort of awareness for people who may be in the first hand contact with animals. But we'll take your question as being on notice, and we'll try and provide you with a more detailed response. So.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, Secretary, because I think obviously we talk about things at a higher level, but at a lower level that may not necessarily be getting through, which is my
there's certainly and I don't need to to tell you, you'd be aware of it. There's been a massive information campaign underway in relation to all sorts of social media and other ways of trying to get through to people, from my department, from MLA, from individual companies. The Gundaroo veterinary surgeon, where I take my dogs, has got a major campaign underway. It goes on and on. But it's a very good point you mentioned that, we want to make sure that there's no possible single point of failure. And so we'll come back as to what the whole system is doing to try and ensure that people are well aware of the symptoms and the way to report them, etc. So.
Terrific. This is my last question, Chair. So I want to understand where we're at with the mRNA vaccination development because of the trade issues that have already been raised with regard to the existing vaccination that we have. So can you give me an update on how we're going with the mRNA vaccine development?
Senator, the Commonwealth, through its matching funding with Meat and Livestock Australia, along with New South Wales Government, the Queensland Government and some private actors in this field, are engaged in a proof of concept for mRNA vaccine as a carrier for potential vaccines for lumpy skin disease and FMD as well. We await the results of that work in regard to any further investment in that particular technology. The Commonwealth also, I think I signed off the other day, I'll have to check whether it's up on AusTender yet, is also putting out an open process to see what other technologies and other platforms are out there for vaccinations in exotic disease. So we are very conscious of what new technologies are out there and where we may invest in those new technologies going forward.
All right, I'll follow that one with interest and continue raising additional funding if that's what is required through the estimates program, because that seems to be our best pathway to maintaining market access going forward should the worst evolve. Thank you, Chair, for your patience.
No, thank you, Senator McDonald. Thank all officials too for bearing with us as we went over time there. Very important issue. I might use this juncture just to remind senators that you can put questions on notice. Would ask you though to get all of those in by tomorrow. So it'll be tomorrow to the committee, because we will set a return date of the 19th of August for those. We will take a short break now while officials move around, because we're going to go into Varroa mite next. We will reconvene at 10:55, and I suspend the committee for a short break.
Thank you.
With officials in regards to Varroa mite. Now, my understanding is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade do not have any involvement on this issue. So I think we've released them, have we, Secretary?
Yes. Yes, we have. I see that.
We are going to. Yep.
Yes, Chair. Foreign Affairs have left us. They have no role, and I see that our colleague from Border Force is still online, and really Border Force have no. This is very much a domestic issue, so Erin could probably drop off if the committee's happy with that.
Thank you, Secretary.
Thank you for your time.
Could I just make a process point? Yeah, I mean, the question doesn't have to be today, but I understand that potentially the Department of Defence might have some involvement in this, considering Williamstown might have been a site where Varroa mite came into Australia. So I do have some questions for them at some stage.
I'm sure officials will be able to take those on notice, unless there's Any objection? I do remind, just on the resumption, I remind witnesses who are speaking for the first time to please state your full name and capacity in which you appear for the Hansard record. I will make an additional request or invitation to make an opening statement if there's anything further you wanted to add, Secretary.
No, thank you very much, Senator. We are joined by our Chief Plant Protection Officer. Bees are dealt with in Plant World, and so she'll introduce herself when she first speaks. So.
Thank you, Secretary. I will go to Senator Whish-Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. I'm not sure exactly who to address my question to then. Could you just give me her name, please, Secretary?
Senator, the Chief Plant Protection Officer is Dr. Gabrielle Vivian Smith.
Oh, yes. Okay.
And so, but if you address it at the department, I think that Dr. Vivian Smith is the expert and will probably do most of the responses to
Okay. Great, thank you. Let's start with quite a broad question. In the Weekend Australian on Saturday, Greg Bearup wrote quite an extensive article about the Varroa outbreak. I was just wondering if you'd read that, Dr. Smith, or anyone else in the department had read that story, and just give the opportunity if there was anything in that 4-page expose that you thought was inaccurate.
Thank you, Senator Whish-Wilson. I have read that article, and I haven't done a sort of a step-by-step analysis of inaccuracies. I have followed up with the Department of Primary Industries in New South Wales, seeking additional information on some of the information that was there.
Yeah, thank you, because obviously some of it was new to me. But just in terms of putting some structuring around my question, I'm just trying to establish, how, or your understanding of how long it will take before we have the parameters of the infestation established. I think in the article it said so far 43 infestation sites have been detected. Is that your understanding of, or is there anything new to add to that?
So the number of infested premises has increased since that article was written, and as at yesterday it was at 83 infested premises. The recent additional infested premises, we've confirmed that they are all linked to existing infested premises, and most of them are in, well, there's no new red zones or outbreak zones. They are all in close proximity to the Newcastle red zone.
Right. Well, I don't know exactly when the article was written. It didn't say 43 when it was published, but that's obviously a doubling of the zones from when the journalist submitted the article. In terms of the origin, it was also talked about in the article that the origin may have been Williamstown through the Department of Defence or through the defence base there. Has there been any work done that you're aware of through the Department of Defence to establish if that's where the infestation started?
In terms of the origin, it was mentioned to be in that Williamstown area. I'm not aware of any contact with the Department of Defence in relation to that. I have sought additional information from New South Wales in terms of, the basis for their, I guess, their epidemiological assessment that it was the first detections are in that Williamstown area, a little bit 15 kilometres away from the Newcastle original detection. There are two potential lines of thinking. It's possible that it has come in from a ship. There were a lot of ships that were sitting in the area around Newcastle during COVID due to supply chain issues. And the other hypothesis is it's come in via perhaps a hitchhiker in an aircraft. There isn't any substantial case that has been presented to me at this point. It's just hypotheses.
That's correct. It's just hypothesis, but I'd be interested at some point in following up what work is being done to,
it's based on
more pinpoint.
Thank you, Senator Whish-Wilson. We'll follow up on that. The key driver for this thinking is mite density. being quite high in that area.
Okay, thank you. I know Senator Colbeck was, I had to leave in his line of questioning in the private hearing, but they also speculated in the article that the infestation may have been at least 6 months old now and date back to December last year, and that DPI is taking that seriously in terms of what the tracking work they're doing. Is that your understanding as well, that this infestation isn't new, it could have been 6 months old?
Yeah, that's correct. We have also sought additional information from New South Wales DPI around the, I guess, the lines of evidence and the epidemiological analysis for that particular figure of December 21. They believe that they're looking at the mite densities in that area and potential reports of colony collapse or at least colony decline in that very local area. So they are probably anecdotal reports and local spread. However, I'm not aware of a sort of multiple expert epidemiological modelling that's been undertaken to support the December claim at this point. It's quite early in our understanding of the pest outbreak in terms of the numbers, and those numbers, as I've indicated, are being added to every day. So the formation of the thinking of the location of the outbreak is still taking place.
Thank you. So given I don't have a lot of time for questions, I'll kind of I'll jump straight into, there's obviously concern about this turning into a super spreader event, both in the horticultural industry as well as the beekeeping and the honey industry. And we know that the major risks of spreading are from transfer of hives, that the mite itself doesn't spread quickly within its own kind of congregations, but it's a movement of hives that's absolutely critical. And that the article speculated that the Coffs Harbour detection had occurred because of a movement of hives that hadn't been reported. My question is, in terms of pollination services required in places like Victoria, are you aware of any detection work that's been done, for example, on the New South Wales-Victoria border around the Sunraysia area?
So there is a lot of work underway at the moment to support the movement of hives, and that includes there's quite a few different requirements that the states and territories have in place that involve testing requirements. New South Wales has a range of testing requirements requiring a certain proportion of bees to be tested for varroa mite and found free before being able to be moved, and Victoria also has testing requirements in place around movement control and also additional restrictions in the Sunraysia region to provide that information and assurance.
Thanks. So to just go back a step there, if you don't mind, Dr. Smith. So there is, at the moment, there's no transfer of hives. I understand Victoria is not issuing licences and New South Wales DPI are not allowing the transfer of hives. But to be clear, there is a process or movement underway to allow hives to be transferred in the near future. Is that your understanding?
So there are able to be hive movements, but they are quite restricted. So there are no movements of hives from New South Wales into Victoria permitted at this point. There are some Victorian hive owners who have had hives just across the border within a very small distance that have been permitted to move their hives if they've only been there for a very limited period of time, so enable their hives to come back home again. And that involves a range of different requirements. Within New South Wales, there are a range of permit requirements in place outside of the control zone and the surveillance zone and the buffer zone in that what we call the blue biosecurity zone, which is believed to be free of varroa mite. And again, they're only allowed to have hive movements under a permit, and they have to meet a range of different requirements to have a permit issued. So I think that probably covers that answer.
So, Senator, just to add to that, talking to my Victorian counterpart, the Victoria has, for a short while, allowed Victorian registered hives, or effectively wintering over the border in New South Wales for a short period, to be moved back into Victoria through a strict registration process if they were close to the border. That process has stopped now, and they haven't extended it to periods where the bees were more active. And I think part of what's caused that to stop in Victoria is now there are movements of hives within New South Wales. They can't be confident that those previous arrangements were sufficient barriers. Yep.
Yeah, correct. That was sort of going to be my next question. The DPI apparently are tracking all movement of hives from the Newcastle area, the area that's been defined as the current outbreak over the last 3 years. But when will we know whether there has been any movements from that area to, for example, Sunraysia or to Victoria? Are you aware of when that kind of data will be available?
So yes, that's the tracing forward and back. So that's underway. As soon as they have a new infested premise, they undertake tracing activities to determine whether those hives have moved from that property within the last 3 years, and that information is provided to the State Control Centre for analysis. And then if there has been a movement of hives interstate, those states and territories are notified of that. To my knowledge, there have been extremely few trace forward notifications to other states and territories, and those states and territories have followed them up, and there have been no concerning circumstances there, although not all of the movements have been resolved yet, and there will be potentially further movements as new infested premises are detected.
Okay. And any idea on when that might be resolved? Because some stakeholders have been saying to us they would rather not see any transfer of hives till these kind of dimensions can be established. And do you think it's reasonable to still be potentially moving hives for pollination services until we know the parameters of the outbreak?
So until the delimitation or the extent of the current infestation is confidently estimated and the number of infested premises determined, we won't necessarily be able to complete all of that information, because it does depend, for completeness, it depends on all of the IPs to be identified.
And Senator, obviously that's driving partly the Victorian response, that because they can't have confidence of the traceability and delineation within New South Wales, then they're taking a more conservative approach to movements. So that's playing out across the country at the minute.
Thank you. I suppose my question would be, it's pretty hard for you to answer at this stage, is how long will that last for? The article in the Weekend Australian said that I think Victoria needs at least 300,000 hives to complete its pollination continuity across different industries, and they're about 70,000 hives short. And they're speculating that there'd be, 10 billion bees moving between states soon to try and meet those pollination services.
So Senator, the only thing I could add to that is the Victorian government are very motivated on the long-term pollination services, and of course that means you've got to think beyond what you can manage this season in terms of the longevity of the bee population in Victoria as well, and that's definitely on their minds.
All right. Look, I'll put some more detailed questions to you on that. It's just 2 other very quick questions, if you don't mind, Chair. In terms of compensation and cost sharing under the Act, I understand if hives are destroyed, and there's already been some payouts by the federal government in relation to beehives that are destroyed. Has compensation been considered for missed pollination income or income foregone by industry participants who will no longer be able to earn that income because their bees won't be allowed to be moved?
Under the emergency response arrangements, there's been no discussion about compensation for pollination services.
Right, and is it permitted though? Like, would it be possible? Would it be feasible for that to occur? Would that be something the federal government could consider under the Act, or is it precluded?
Well, I think we'd have to take that on notice, Senator, but we don't own the full response deed. That is jointly owned between governments and industry. And so it has a specifically narrow scope to containment and eradication.
Yeah, because it seems to me that the feedback I've got is there would be obviously a number of bee owners that would be under significant financial pressure to find work for their bees in the current situation. I don't know, this is a very new thing. This is the first time we've had this infestation, but the industry has been preparing for it for some time, and there'll be a lot of people out of pocket because of this.
Yes, understood, Senator. I mean, I think those are live discussions. Probably the main focus remains still on the eradication program, and that is the current technical view that that's possible and should still be pursued. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Look, last line of questioning, and I may have to put, two questions. I may have to put this one on more detail. I've been having a look at the fipronil licensing arrangements. It's something I've used in the past as a vineyard owner for European wasps, and I'm quite familiar with its application. But yeah, I was just interested, are you overseeing any, from a federal point of view? I mean, obviously there's going to have to be massive applications of fipronil. Just with the 6,700 square kilometre area that's been zoned off at the moment, with APVMA approval of every 500 metres for a baiting station, within a 10-kilometre radius, you're looking at 400 baits over that area. I think we've estimated about 8,500 baits needed. That'll be monitored every hour and recycled every 3 days. It's a very big undertaking, just in the area we've already got. Will you be checking from a federal environment point of view potential impacts on native bees and other biology or biological ecosystem services?
So the fipronil baiting's being carried out by New South Wales DPI under the APVMA permit conditions, and that's probably a matter for the APVMA and the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. I know that they're consulting with the state EPA as well as part of that process, so it's quite a joined up approach.
But federal government would have oversight under EPBC of potential impacts, so wouldn't they?
Yes, and that is an issue would have been an issue for this department prior to the machinery government changes. Senator, it's now a matter for the Department of Climate Change, Environment and Water. We can let them know of your interest, but we're not aware of any sort of active work from their point as to whether it triggers any any triggers under the EPBC Act.
Yeah, look, if you could, and I'm not obviously I support the use of this to try and rein in this problem, but if the scale continues to expand and we're using a significant amount of this stuff, it is potentially quite damaging to the environment. So it may be something we have to have a look at. Last question from me was in terms of sort of the legal powers for the Commonwealth under the Act. Does the Commonwealth have the ability to enforce a kind of a national standstill on the transfer of beehives, or is it something that you need to work with Plant Health and the states on?
I think we'll have to take that one on notice. Currently, the standstill is being enforced by the New South Wales, and all of the requirements, their legal requirements, are outlined in the New South Wales Government Gazette.
We'll take it on notice, Senator, but I'm not aware of any sort of federal legislation that overrides state legislation. The Biosecurity Act is very much, the Commonwealth Biosecurity Act is very much about our role at the border, and any biosecurity issues that occur within Australia are regulated by the states and territories, and that's always been the case since Federation.
And these are activities that are regulated by the states and territories, so it would seem unusual if we had the power to override them, particularly for a nationally agreed plan. But we can have a look at that.
Okay, but when once like an emergency has been declared, the nationally agreed plan kicks in with its predetermined parameters.
Yeah.
But doesn't the minister, under the Act, doesn't the minister have the power to veto beehive movements?
Well, we can take that on notice, but I mean, the way these mechanisms work is there's a predetermined set of mechanisms that allow access to the financial resources of industry and governments, and they're managed under deeds, in this case looked after by Plant Health Australia, a sort of independent organisation. So actually it doesn't require the minister to do anything. Basically, parties agree on a response plan, which in this case is prepared by New South Wales as being the location of the incursion. That plan has to be agreed by jurisdictions and also by industry, and that enables access to the financial resources that are already flowing into New South Wales because of that.
Yeah. I'll double check for accuracy, Senator, but I'm almost 100% confident that there would have actually been required to be a constitutional referral of powers, should the states agree that the Commonwealth should have some sort of overriding step-in power. And the very reason that we have these sort of deeds and other instruments is in recognition of the fact that there is no overriding Commonwealth power here. It is very much the role of the states and territories in a collaborative way to work on these issues, and the Commonwealth's role is primarily in a coordination sense and as a funder or a part funder of the response.
Okay, interesting. The article. I'll finish on this. The article making lots of references to COVID and how the federal government, in the similarity in terms of the spread and super spreader events, and I'll put some more detailed questions on notice in that regard.
Yeah. So obviously,
thank you,
Senator. Sorry, I was just going to say the intent of the plan is for it to not be a super spreader event. Obviously, eradication is still the focus.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Whish-Wilson. I was generous there, given your patience.
Chair, I really appreciate that.
That's right, no problems. We'll go to Senator White. Back to 10 minutes now, Senator White. Sorry, 10 minutes.
Thank you. When was the Minister for Agriculture advised of the Varroa mite incursion in New South Wales?
I'm not sure if we've got the exact dates. My colleagues might, but he was advised as soon as we had the notification. Dr.
Yeah, I don't have the exact date of when the minister was advised of the notification, but I can take that one on notice.
There is a pattern of providing regular, almost real-time updates to the minister's office on developments, so that it would be, if not daily, every second or third day. Yep.
So this might be a bit harder to answer, but what action was taken immediately after the incursion was known?
So Senator, my colleague can probably describe in more detail, but as I said, this is almost like a predetermined response model. So what happens is it's determined through Dr. Vivian Smith's committee and with the help of Plant Health Australia where the incursion has come, where the incursion lies, who's the lead jurisdiction, and some various parameters around that. That triggers the development of a response plan, which is then formally agreed through what's called the National Management Group, which I chair. But Dr. Vivian Smith? Yeah, so states and territories, when they detect what they suspect to be an emergency plant pest, and in this case Varroa destructor is considered to be an emergency plant pest, they're required to meet their deed requirements. They're required to report that suspect detection within 24 hours to the Australian Chief Plant Protection Office. And in providing that notification, it then essentially triggers the emergency plant pest response deed, and the committee for the consultative committee for emergency plant pests is then essentially brought into action for that pest, and works with the lead jurisdiction. This particular committee comprises industry members who have signed up to the deed, so the affected industry parties, as well as the state and territory chief plant protection officers and myself.
and they are notified of the detection and brought together to consider the matter and the appropriate course of action. In this case, they determined that it was an emergency plant pest, that it probably was very early, but there was no reason to think that it wasn't technically feasible to eradicate at that time, and that New South Wales should prepare and present a response plan as soon as possible. So essentially what the course of events was, on the 22nd of June, my office was notified, and on the 23rd of June, the consultative committee was notified and advised that a meeting was being convened. The first meeting of that consultative committee to consider the response occurred on the 24th of June.
At what stage did the federal government offer assistance to the New South Wales government?
So under the Emergency Plant Pest Response Deed, there's a range of different... So we offered immediate assistance. We basically, as soon as I heard of it, it was like, let us know if you need any specific assistance. But essentially under the Emergency Plant Pest Response Deed, once a response plan has been provided and endorsed by the National Management Group, the states and territories, the Commonwealth and the affected industry parties are all contributing to that response financially. They were all contributing technically as well to the actual response strategy and thinking, and there are a range of other arrangements that can be triggered or are triggered and available to the state, which include interstate deployment requests and requests for assistance for specialists, for example, and other response personnel that come through to other states and territories and through to the Commonwealth.
So do I take it then that the Commonwealth's response specifically in this instance was financial contributions and staff resources? Is that right?
Yeah, so the contribution to ensuring that the eradication plan, is funded, and then other assistance technically by convening the Consultative Committee for Emergency Plant Pests, bringing all of those parties together, providing technical support and offering further support where necessary or where requested for New South Wales.
And Senator, if I could just say that when this comes to the National Management Group, which in this case was the 8th of July when the plan was agreed, there had already been a very high level of engagement between jurisdictions and a large number of industry groups, and so it was all hands to the pump kind of discussion and agreeing that plan. Yep.
Are you able to estimate how many DAF staff have been engaged in the Varroa mite response?
I'll have to take that one on notice. I don't think we've done that estimate, but we'll take that on notice.
So
Thank you.
Senator, the bulk of the work is obviously done by the New South Wales government, so there's a significant financial input, but there's coordination input as well.
And I guess just to provide some indication.
Just give me 1 second. I'm just making sure my video is muted.
So yesterday...
Speaking there, so if you could mute, thank you.
So yesterday, New South Wales had in place 200...
just give me 1 sec. I'm pretty sure I'm not muted.
We can still hear you, Senator Whish-Wilson.
I'm glad you discovered that. Sorry, continue.
Just to give you an idea of the scale of the response, Senator, yesterday the number of personnel on duty in the New South Wales control centres was 259, and that included a range of staff from different agencies across New South Wales, as well as volunteer beekeepers and industry liaison officers as well. Thank you.
And so if it were, if the unthinkable happened and that there was a Varroa mite incursion in another state, if it was detected elsewhere, what would be the action? Is it exactly the same action that you described for the first incursion, or is it something different?
So that would be considered to be a very significant detection, and one which would potentially change the nature and the course of what is a national response. Even though it's taking part in New South Wales, it's essentially a national response to this incursion. The state and territory that detect that would need to report to my office within 24 hours, being a significant detection of an outlying population. We would then convene another meeting of this consultative committee, the technical experts from industry, from state and territory governments and from the Commonwealth, to provide advice and assess the situation and determine the technical feasibility of eradication and come up with some recommended courses of action. Those recommendations would then go to the National Management Group for consideration, and there may be another response plan drawn up in that situation if it still remained technically feasible and cost beneficial to eradicate.
So finally, what is the role of the federal government in leading a response in that if there was a further incursion?
If we encounter significant complexity in the responses, particularly if it's in multiple states, there is a provision within the national arrangements associated with the Emergency Plant Pest Response Deed and other national biosecurity emergency response arrangements for the Commonwealth or another jurisdiction, potentially, if it made sense to do so, to set up a national coordination centre, and this national coordination centre would coordinate the activities of those multiple states and territories.
Thanks very much, Chair.
All right, caught me on the hop there. Thank you, Senator White. I will go to Senator McDonald.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to expand on the biosecurity issues of risks coming into the country. In North Queensland, we know that we've ended up with yellow crazy ant. We've got the other ants down here around the southeast Queensland. There's a number of mites and insects that have got in. Fall armyworm appeared in the country through the north. And specifically, the cane guys are talking to me, Sugar Research Australia, about moth borer and whiteleaf. I just want to understand, I have previously had conversations with the department about frontline protections, particularly through containers and the processes for being able to use more technology to allow for videos of seal breakings, of inspections and fumigations. I just want to know, where are you up to with feeling confident that our front line through containers, through imports, and again into the north, that we do have a strong biosecurity wall? And does the department need more resources in order for that to truly happen and be effective?
Senator Andrew Metcalfe, I'll ask Mr Hunter to join us again. He has responsibility for border operations, which are the various pathways into Australia. But you're right, and indeed as sort of recognised not only in the National Biosecurity Strategy but the Commonwealth Biosecurity Strategy of a year ago, our assessment is that we are facing an increasing level of threat, and of course there have been some significant additional resources provided to the department over the last couple of years. It's probably not appropriate for me to say do we need more, but you can probably guess what my answer would be. Our focus is on pathways and pests, and so Mr Hunter can talk about pathways and Dr Vivian Smith can talk about particular plant pests, and you mentioned red imported fire ants, for example, as well as yellow crazy ants, as well as fall armyworm. There are any number of other pests. Northern Australia is a particular place of great interest to us because, as you know, some pests can literally blow in across the sea or across the border with New Guinea or with Indonesia. Japanese encephalitis is another very good example of a pest. Cyro have now, I think, worked out which particular cyclone brought in the mosquitoes that then found their way into the waterbird population, and that then spread ultimately through to pigs and then to people in southern Australia. So the Northern Australian quarantine strategy, which is decades old now, is a critical part of our overall preparedness and surveillance. We operate fly traps, we operate insect traps, we operate sentinel herds. Our vets do, testing, post-mortem testing of feral animals, but we are always looking at what more we can do and what technologies we can use. Similarly, with pathways through cargo and through mail, we're looking to employ additional technologies, X-rays in particular, robots and so on. You saw the issues we faced last year and the year before with Capra beetle, coming through unconventional ways, through effectively household goods, whereas normally we'd never seen that before. So all of those issues have gone into our thinking about the National Biosecurity Strategy, which very much has governments committing to continuing their focus, looking at their funding and their resourcing and their collaborative effort, and how we can collectively as a biosecurity family work together, Commonwealth, states, territories, industry and every Australian. So having made those general comments, I'll ask my colleagues just to provide some specific details. So.
Thanks, Senator. And we've spoken in this place before about the various pathways that that we regulate, and then of course there's the unregulated pathways such as sort of the wind-borne and natural pathway. But I'll speak more just about the broader scenarios that from the picture that the Secretary has already painted. So we have the mail and we have the traveller pathway, which we've sort of traversed in relation to foot and mouth disease in Indonesia. But then in the cargo area, the things that we're regulating there is really the conveyances. So that's the craft on which the cargo is arriving here, or the people are arriving here. And of course that could be in a maritime world. That can be commercial, non-commercial vessels, it can be cruise vessels and a whole range of things, can be aircraft, etc. And then in cargo, as the Secretary mentioned, we have sort of sub-pathway elements of air and sea. So in my world and at the border, we're very concerned about three types of things. So if cargo, anything approaching Australia arriving on the conveyance, so, in this case, bees on masts of ships or embedded on containers and these sorts of things. We're also then very concerned about the content of the container, and I operate on strict risk assessment advice I get from my plant and animal colleagues as to how I need to intervene with the contents of the containers. And then, of course, we've got the container itself. The container can either be dirty inside, can be dirty outside, and there's a whole range of schema that are in place right across our system to ensure that our profiles operate on the best available advice. But just to give you an idea of the breadth of that, Senator, there are 88 million imports of cargo into Australia. The vast majority of those come in non-commercial consignments through air couriers. So these are the self-assessed clearances. And then on top of that, there are many, many containers. There's many shipments of break bulk and these sorts of things, which provide many opportunities for hitchhiker pests. And again, in this place, we've talked extensively about the measures that we've put in place under the former government and continued in the current government in relation to hitchhiker pests, which are really at the nub of what we're talking about here. It'd be very rare, for example, for a bee to be contained inside a container. It would be a hitchhiker pest, and whether or not that then bee can establish in Australia and carry varroa mite to various areas. So that's sort of just a quick picture. But I just finally just let you know, Senator, that we operate what we call a strict series of first port of arrivals under the Biosecurity Act. So no one can just arrive in Australia with a commercial vessel, a non-commercial vessel. Every port is assessed as to the type of cargoes or the type of passage it may have into Australia and what it can actually discharge in various ports. So in the example of Williamtown before, it can't discharge commercial cargoes, but it can discharge passengers and baggage. So it depends on which ports for Australia as to how we actually regulate those first ports of arrival.
Thank you. I guess, now having done 3 years in this job, I'm getting better at connecting what I see on the ground, in North Queensland and Northern Australia and what we talk about at estimates. And I guess where I'm getting to is specifically if we look at things like yellow crazy ants that are threatening species of crab that they're, killing, feral pigs that are eating turtle eggs and cassowary eggs, the on-the-ground stuff, which we know. We don't need any more studies. The department absolutely is aware, but I'm concerned that we just are not resourcing the very practical on-the-ground measures that would see these eradication programs actually effective. So we've spent $10 million, I think over 3 years, trying to address yellow crazy ants in Cairns. There's an outbreak now in Townsville. Pigs, this is, I can't get money for people to go and trap and destroy pigs in rainforest areas or cropping areas, but everybody keeps telling me there's money available. So how do I help you? How does Senator Whish-Wilson, who I know shares is concerned, Senator Colbeck, Senator Canavan, everybody who's on here, how do we light a fire under the ERC to give you more money to get it out on the ground so that we actually do the stuff that you talk about? Because you know this. I'm impressed constantly with the department's step.
Senator, as we've discussed, at great length at estimates, the Commonwealth Government's role under the Constitution is essentially in relation to our borders, and that's where our department has the key role that Mr Hunter and I have been describing. In relation to pests that make it here, and as I said in my opening statement, the prickly pear that came on the first fleet, the rabbits that came on the first fleet, the foxes, the feral pigs, the deer, the plant pests, the lantana, on and on it goes. Effectively, that land management or feral management is the primary responsibility of the state jurisdiction it's in. And each state resources that differently and has particular pressures at particular times. I think New South Wales have just announced that they've culled roughly 20,000 feral pigs in the last few months, for example. So they've had a major program in relation to feral pigs. But pigs and plant pests don't respect state boundaries, and they move across them pretty rapidly, and some can move very rapidly, as we saw with fall armyworm move down into Australia and then right down through southern Australia. Japanese encephalitis is another example. And that's where the national sort of arrangements come into place, that the National Biosecurity Strategy is the latest iteration. It's the first time we've actually had a national strategy. And the collective governments, for me, it was a matter of great pride that we've got 9 signatures on that document from each state and territory minister and the Commonwealth minister, in which they do commit to do certain things. And ultimately, it then becomes a question for, resource allocation, priorities within each government and Treasury portfolios as to what resources can actually be allocated. At the Commonwealth level, there's bipartisan support for increased cost recovery arrangements, and so that's something the department is now seeking to bring forward for implementation, through budget processes, so that it's not just taxpayer money, but it's sort of users and benefactors of the system who are contributing to the system as well. But this is one of those classic Commonwealth state joined up issues where we all have a responsibility, but where the National Biosecurity Strategy and I think the recent focus on the threat of FMD have greatly broadened awareness, and I'll leave it up to you and your political colleagues as to what pressure you can bear and bring to bear on the system for those people who actually make resourcing decisions. So.
Fair enough. Well, I'm aware that there's 59 extension officers in Queensland. We are just, I am I'm taking on board your comments about the federal-state connection. You know, we are flat-footed, under-resourced, and it's frankly very concerning that you know, you're being held to account here at this foot and mouth and veramite discussion, but really it's the extension officers across the states who have to do the heavy lifting potentially once it gets in. You've pointed that out, and I will take this up in another forum then. But
yeah, well, we've all seen the costs. You know, we've talked about the costs, God forbid, of an FMD incursion, which is not just cost to, you know, the animal industries, but, you know, broader society and the economy. But the cost of the red imported fire ant incursion in southeast Queensland is now in the hundreds of millions of dollars to try and eradicate that particular pest. But we all know that if it breaks out of the Brisbane Valley and gets over the divide, it can potentially migrate, you know, down the Murray-Darling or down the Darling, the Condamine-Darling system. And so these are very expensive issues, and that's why the more we can do to prevent, the more we can do offshore to work with near neighbours and others, and not just near neighbours, because, you know, some of these pests come from far away and are conveyed on ships or planes or people. And that's where our border interventions are so important. But you can rest assured that this is a huge focus for us, and I know that my counterparts around the Agriculture Senior Officials Group and the National Biosecurity Committee are very focused on it, and will continue to work with you know, all of our governments to try and ensure we have the best possible arrangements. So.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. I'll go to Senator Colbeck. I would like to try and finish off the next 10 minutes if we can. We've also got questions from Senator Roberts, just because we do have the CSIRO waiting as well. Thank you, Senator Colbeck.
Thanks, Chair. Has there been an assessment of cost to the country if Varroa becomes endemic in a similar way there has FMD?
So there has been some estimates. So, for example, pollination, the contribution of pollination services and products to the Australian economy is estimated to be 14.3 billion per annum. And that would be severely impacted if both feral bees and managed hives were impacted by Varroa mite. The most recent estimate that I have is not for the entire continent of Australia, but ABARES has undertaken a recent update of an estimate that they had undertaken a few years ago. They've estimated that the cost over 30 years of an incursion at the Port of Sydney would be calculated to be 5.2 billion without containment and 3.8 billion with containment. So that represents probably a small proportion of, you know, the potential impact in other areas where there's significant beehives.
Okay. So the assessment at this point in time is that we still believe we can eradicate.
That's correct. The advice to date has been that the current incursion remains technically feasible to eradicate.
Okay. So the work that's being done on the movement of hives, my notes said it was movement over the last 12 months, but you're saying it's movement over the last 3 years. Is how close is that to being completed, and how accurate are the records, in your view?
So the movement of hives over the last 3 years, that information is gathered through tracing interviews with each property where there's been a positive detection of Varroa mite, so what we call an infested premise. And so the information is really, you know, it's gathered through diligent efforts of tracing officers and provided through that means. There's potential, you know, issues in terms of accuracy if not all of the records are present, or you know, hives have moved and people have forgotten about them. But generally what we're getting a sense of is that it's fairly accurate information.
So we're not actually doing a complete assessment of the movement of hives in New South Wales, even over the last 12 months, let alone the last 3 years. It's only where we find a detection.
That's correct. At the moment, the tracing effort is based on tracing back any infested hives or hives found at infested premises to see where they may have been transported to. There isn't a national traceability system for hives in place like there is for livestock, but beehives are required to, beekeepers are required to register their hives, and at least the registration process provides some element of, I guess, traceability information, but the tracing information that is tracking back those hives for 3 years is restricted to the infested premises.
Could I just
sorry,
Senator Colbeck, I asked the same question, but I noticed you didn't get a response there as to how long the existing tracing system is going to take.
Yeah.
No, and
well, my concern is that we're not actually tracing the zones. Rather, we're only tracing the infected sites, not the infected zones, because at least tracing the infected zones would give you some better idea of where it might be moving. And, you know, as Senator Whish-Wilson quite correctly said, it's relatively slow moving. It moves with bees, which is most likely to be a drone that's moving around, and a drone will be accepted in any hive or by the separation and movement of hives. But we still have a relatively limited visibility, given we're only looking at infected sites, and the number of infected premises has doubled in recent weeks. So my question really is the effectiveness of only looking at infected sites, because you know, the speculation in the story on Saturday was that it's been here since December. I've had it put to me that it could have been here even longer. And so why aren't we looking at the infected zones for particularly that sort of red zone for our traceability, because that would be a much better mitigation against spread and by movement of hive, which is going to be the thing that drives it, rather than just infected sites. And so what, I mean, this comes back to the national process that Senator Whish-Wilson asked about, our influence over something like that, and the process of agreeing these principles through the EADRA, or through the committee that's been set up. Surely there's a national interest in that.
So just to give you an idea of, so that the tracing effort is risk-based. So there's, at the moment, as soon as they find an infested premise, they'll do the tracing. If they identify any movements of hives, that essentially will identify what's called a dangerous contact premise and other premises which might be considered suspect or at risk. And those types of premises are then investigated, and if they're found to be positive, there's further tracing carried out. So it's sort of an iterative process. To give you an idea why perhaps it's not, they're not able to undertake tracing for all of the hives in New South Wales in the eradication zone, they've got at least 100, they've got about 160 registered commercial beekeepers and almost 2,000 recreational beekeepers in that red zone, and each of those would potentially have, you know, multiple hives, particularly the commercial beekeepers. So being able to track and trace every single hive is a very labour-intensive process. So New South Wales DPI is being quite sensible about that, and they're really just focusing on the highest risk movements and the highest risk information to provide confidence that they are actively delimiting the incursion and identifying any further at-risk premises or dangerous contact premises that they need to then chase up. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
In relation to the movement of hives then, how confident, and this is outside the zones, given that we're still discovering as late as last week new areas where there are infected hives up at Coffs Harbour, are we comfortable in the inspection rate of the hives? I think for movement of hives in New South Wales outside of the zones, it's a requirement for a 10% inspection rate. Are we comfortable that that's a satisfactory level of inspection?
New South Wales has, provided, or they're in the process of gathering information to provide to the consultative committee information to assure or provide confidence that the data that they're collecting is supporting the movement of clean hives only, and that they seem to be quite confident that the hives that are in the blue zone that are being permitted to move are providing strong case or information, reliable information that would indicate that those hives are clear of varroamite. Of course, we're dealing with quite a new situation. There's a range of different tests available, and it's natural that there's some uncertainty and some question, and rightly so, some questions being asked to provide that assurance. So we are, it's not a perfect science, this, and there is an element of uncertainty there that needs to be worked through.
Okay, look, one final question. I'm being wound up so we can bring CSIRO on, and I appreciate that. In relation to the measures at the border, where we have a number of sentinel hives around the country, and if you can give us on notice the number of those sentinel hives, the difference between a sentinel hive, which we currently have, and a bait trap hive, I mean, a hive of bees on a ship or a boat or somewhere like that who comes into port wanting to move off the ship to find somewhere to settle are not going to go to an existing hive, they're going to find somewhere to nest. And so a scented or a baited trap hive is more likely to find them than it is a sentinel hive. The sentinel hive, as I understand it, is a secondary mechanism to find the bees. So we found them in Newcastle, but they've clearly come from somewhere else. You're more likely to find them in a trap hive. How many trap hives do we have, and which can be monitored in real time via video? And I think you can provide us with some vision of that, which I'd appreciate in time. But I'm interested in the balance between the trap hive versus the sentinel hive, because I think they would give a trap hive would give us a much earlier visibility of an incursion than the sentinel hive.
Thanks, Senator Colbeck. That's a really good question. So the current program that's in place, which is called the National Bee Pest Surveillance Program, I don't have the exact numbers of hives that have been deployed around the country. That is a program that is administered or managed by Plant Health Australia and delivered by state and territory agencies. The program itself deploys a range of different surveillance activities, so they use a mixture of different surveillance activities at high-risk locations to detect exotic bees and bee pests. That includes these sentinel hives that we've been talking about. They also include swarm and nest capture, so if swarms or nests are detected in those locations, they are captured and dealt with. They also have standard catch boxes, so these are the empty beehives that a swarm, and what we call an absconding swarm from a ship, may find attractive and therefore provide early detection. And there's also, in some locations, there's what we are referring to as remote catch boxes. So these are empty beehives with remote sensing capabilities. Also undertaken are activities such as floral sweep netting to just look at the bee population in the area. That often takes place if, for example, there is a report of a swarm or a feral nest, or if there's been a risk notified by vessels or imported cargo operators at the ports. There's also a range of other activities such as hive frame inspection, alcohol wash and sugar shake, which are to detect the mites, drone uncapping, which is also an inspection technique to look for varroa mites and other bee pests. They utilise a caricide or a miticide application, and then there's a sticky mat which is deployed as well, so that the frass or the detritus that drops out of the beehive drops onto that sticky mat, and that can contain mites. And they also undertake additional sample collection for pests that might be carried by varroa mites, such as viruses. So a range of activities. I don't have because it's deployed. It's put in place by state and territory agencies and managed by Plant Health Australia. I don't have a breakdown with me, but we can gather that information for you and provide it. We also have been undertaking some research to try and, develop better techniques for monitoring pests. For example, eDNA, the department's funded program with University of Canberra and James Cook University to try and identify bee pests and diseases efficiently using eDNA technology, for example, from rainbow bee eater pellets, as they gather bees and may provide early detection systems. So we're constantly looking at new and improved techniques.
Okay. I just want to confirm that all of the detections outside Newcastle are from movements that we understand were taken prior to the advice of the outbreak, because there is some concern that the Coffs Harbour one may have been subsequent.
Right, okay. So yes, we're advised that all of the detections are linked. So they're either linked by direct movement or they're linked because bees have moved from those hives in a very localised pattern to other hives nearby. There are no unlinked detections at this point. The Coffs Harbour detection, I've received information from New South Wales about this. They've advised that 30 hives were moved from the Newcastle area, the infested premise that is linked to the Nana Glen detection in April 2022, so that was prior to the detection of varroa mite. And they've done some epidemiological analyses. They've only found a total of 3 mites in the alcohol washes of all of the 30 hives that were moved, and they've euthanized those hives. So they're now undertaking intensive surveillance around that area, and the mites have not been detected in surveillance so far.
Yeah, but my reading would suggest that for 3 mites you find in a tray at the bottom of a hive, there's 120 mites in the hive. So there's a fairly significant conversion rate for those discovered in a sugar shake or alcohol wash or something of that nature back into the hive. So, and the appropriate action's been taken, I suppose.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, and I think, sorry, just to clarify, Senator Colbeck, I think that when they find a new detection like this in an outlying area, they do much more intensive surveillance to really get a handle on the number of mites. So it's not like just the standard procedure. They'll actually do really look at that hive and do more intensive alcohol washes of all of the hives rather than just a subsample of 10% of the hives, for example. So the 3 hives that were found is indicative, as you say, but it is indicative of a low population of mites that were present.
Okay, I better surrender, Chair.
Chair, could I just ask one clarifying question, please, in relation to that? So in terms of that, when that was reported, is it your understanding that the beekeeper that moved those hives in April had previously reported it under some system, or had just recently fessed up to moving those hives?
So I don't have the exact details, but essentially when that beekeeper was found to be positive for varroa mite, that tracing interview was undertaken, and through that tracing interview they determined that a number of hives had moved from the Newcastle infested premise to Nana Glen, which is what would have triggered the investigation of the Nana Glen property as a trace forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We've still got Senator Roberts, and as quickly as possible would be great, Senator Roberts, because we do need to get on the CSIRO. Senator Roberts. Senator Roberts, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for giving me the call, and also thank you for attending today, the witnesses. My understanding is that the impact over 10 years of Varroa mite is estimated to be $5.2 billion without containment, $3.8 billion with containment. Is that correct, just quickly?
That's the estimated cost over 30 years, Senator Roberts, of an incursion at the Port of Sydney, $5.2 billion without containment and $3.8 billion with containment.
Okay, thank you. Is it true that Australia is the only country that, up until this recent infestation, hadn't had Varroa mite?
It's the largest continent without Varroa mite. There are a few islands, and I don't have a list of exactly which is where are free of Varroa mite or not, but Varroa mite has spread very widely globally since the 1980s, and Australia is the only continent free of Varroa mite. Even New Zealand has Varroa mite, other than a few offshore, small offshore islands.
Thank you. Has it been eradicated anywhere?
Not to my knowledge. We can find out about that. There may have been localised eradications, but I don't believe there have been any successful eradications. Generally, the detection of the Varroa mite has been too late when they have first detected it, and it has been too widespread.
Could I get your comments on notice, rather than take up time now, please, on whether or not we are looking at a good possibility of eradication, please?
Senator, if I may, I think we've already answered that, because that's the consensus position that's behind the national plan that's been enacted, and it is still the view to date.
Yeah, I heard that earlier. Thank you for your answer. I heard that earlier, but I'd like to know relative to other places that have detected the Varroa mite in the same process, at the same stage of the process, if you like. In other words, I'd like to know what our chances are relative to other countries.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, Senator Roberts. So Australia is in an advantageous position in that we have a very good, strong biosecurity system which is able to respond, and we know a lot more about Varroa mite, including the impacts of Varroa mite, than did other countries when it first arrived. So it spread around the world quite quickly, and many countries that don't have such a robust biosecurity system and perhaps had a poorer understanding of the potential impacts of Varroa mite were not able to respond to it. They may not have had surveillance systems in place, so it was very widespread. I think New Zealand detected Varroa mite in around 2000, and again, it was fairly widespread. They did attempt to eradicate in some capacity, but were, I guess, eventually unsuccessful. You know, it's 20 years since that significant incursion, and learnings from that are quite great. So Australia is in a much more informed position, and we are backed up by an extremely good biosecurity system where everyone works together across states, territories and industries to respond to these incursions. So I'll leave it at that, but I think we're in as good a position to respond really as we can be, and favourably, quite favourably compared to other countries in a similar situation.
Okay. Thank you for that. Last question, third question, we'll make it the last. What has been the impact in other countries, in particular New Zealand, and I'm talking more about other industries, not just the honeybees and the honey production, but I'm imagining all plant-based products, whether it be grains, whether it be vegetables, whether it be fruits. Is there anything beyond those? And what's it done to New Zealand?
So I don't have those figures with me. There have been a range of different studies that have looked at various aspects of the impact in New Zealand. We'll have to take that one on notice, and perhaps my CSIRO colleagues, it might be something that they have information on as well.
Senator, we could try and
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
We can try and cover that in our submission, I think.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Thank you, officials. That brings us to the end of this first one. I really appreciate your patience, given we are a fair way over time. Given the length of time, we'll still take a 15-minute break to give everyone a chance to refresh. So we'll reconvene at 12:20 p.m. With the CSIRO, and I suspend this hearing.
Thanks very much.
I will resume this hearing of the Rural Affairs and Regional Transport. Is that right? Have I got that right? Committee, something like that. References Committee. Just before I do welcome the CSIRO, I did forget to stress before the break that we are setting the Friday the 19th of August for return of questions on notice. I did flag that earlier. And if senators could get those into the committee by close of business tomorrow to facilitate that. But I do now welcome representatives from the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today? I will let you decide the order of that. So who wants to go first?
My name is Trevor Drew. I'm the director of the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness down in Geelong for CSIRO.
Thank you, Mr. Drew, or Dr. Drew, sorry. Next.
I'm Vilna Foslia. I'm also based at the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, research scientist.
Thank you.
Raghu Satyamurthy, Research Program Director for Biosecurity with CSIRO's Health and Biosecurity Business Unit.
Thank you.
Dr. Andy Shepherd, I'm a Senior Principal Research Scientist at CSIRO focusing on biosecurity.
Thank you very much. I think that might be it, unless anyone else wants to speak up. And I now, if you'd like to, it's up to you. Would you like to make an opening statement to the committee, or should we go straight to questions?
Yes, I'll be pleased to make a statement. We were also expecting my colleague Kirsten Rose, who tried to join, but I think she had audio problems. So, as I explained, I'm the director of the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, and we have with us Dr. Andy Shepherd, the Senior Principal Research Scientist for Biological Invasions, Dr. Vilna Foslia, the Group Leader for Disease Mitigation Technologies, and Dr. Raghu Satyamurthy, the Biosecurity Research Program Director. I'd like to think that we're all experts in these research specialities that span disease research, diagnostics, and preparedness. And I see that my colleague Kirsten is here now. I don't know whether you have audio and would like to take up the introductory statement or let me continue.
Thanks, Trevor. Can I just check everyone can hear me now?
Yes, fine.
Okay, great. Thanks. Apologies for that, committee. I had some audio difficulty. I'll pick up. Thank you.
Ms. Rose, could you just introduce yourself as well, just for the Hansard, as before you launch into that? Thank you.
Certainly. My name's Kirsten Rose, and I am the Executive Director of CSIRO Future Industries. And again, apologies for my delay. As Dr. Drew was saying, I believe he's just introduced our team today. We have brought experts today whose research specialties span disease research, diagnostics, and preparedness. CSIRO has a long and rich history helping Australia maintain a biosecurity system that, as we've heard over the course of this inquiry, that is the envy of much of the world. We work across a range of research and diagnostic-related areas in plant and animal biosecurity. We have also published 2 major reports on opportunities and challenges facing the Australian biosecurity system. And the most recent of these reports, titled Australia's Biosecurity Future, was published in 2020 and was developed in partnership with Animal Health Australia, Plant Health Australia, and the Centre for Invasive Species Solutions. It proposes some major transformations with regard to how Australia prepares for biosecurity resilience into the future. This report and some of the other reports that Secretary Metcalf referenced earlier are all guiding our research towards a One Health approach, considering human, agricultural, environmental, and marine health sectors to biosecurity, along with strong collaboration across governments, industry, research, and the community. And I'd be happy to share a copy of this report with the committee if appropriate. In the context of today's inquiry, we'll highlight two specific roles for CSIRO in the system. One is in pre-border biosecurity preparedness, and the other is the critical role we play in the event of an outbreak. Pre-border biosecurity preparedness, or preventing and reducing threats before they get to the border, is of course our best defense against outbreaks of threatening diseases. And for decades, we've been working with our international partners to build laboratory and biosecurity capacity across Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Timor-Leste, and Papua New Guinea. CSIRO also has a critical role in biosecurity through our high security laboratory facility in Geelong, the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, which is the national reference lab for emergency animal diseases. This is where we conduct lab testing and research in the event of an outbreak. ACDP is the only lab of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere and was instrumental in the rapid global response to the COVID-19 outbreak and other outbreaks such as Japanese encephalitis and avian influenza. And it would no doubt play a critical role in the event of an exotic disease outbreak in Australia. In light of the increased threat of foot and mouth disease, varroa mite, and a number of other diseases exotic to Australia, CSIRO is bolstering its capability, both through staff and lab resources. We're working closely to support the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, focusing on prevention activities and vaccine development. Our goal is to deliver solutions to ensure Australia is prepared and ready to respond to both existing and emerging risks to protect our environment, our agricultural history, and our agricultural industry and our way of life. Today with my colleagues, we'll be happy to take questions from the committee, and I'll do my best to direct a bit of traffic to our relevant experts. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms Rose. Thank you to all the officials. And I should have said at the start, thank you for your patience too. I know we're way behind time, but we're politicians, so that's the way we roll. Look, I just got a few questions to start off with, and then Senator Ciccone. It came up earlier, I don't know if you were listening, with the department. I had a question about the detection of fragments. I think the term would be viral fragments in some meat products recently, some pork floss in particular. Did the CSIRO play a role in testing or checking on that identification, and if so, what was it?
Yeah, Dr. Drew, would you like to take that one?
Yes, indeed. We have been involved and working closely with the border security services in really using these intercepts as a means of assessing the risk that they might pose. And as part of that, we have been testing seizures for a number of different diseases. The viral fragments themselves do not denote the fact that the meat is infectious, but their detection does demonstrate the high sensitivity of our detection systems. These products that are imported from infected countries do undergo processing steps, those which are officially imported, and these are described in the World Organization for Animal Health Terrestrial Code, and these are assured to inactivate the virus. But of course, those meat products that might be smuggled into the country illegally may pose more of a risk. That said, we are not able at this time to perform isolation of for foot and mouth disease virus, but we have been looking for African swine fever, and the percentage of meat seizures that were positive to African swine fever were about 40% in the last round, and only about 20% in the current round of testing that we've been doing. We've attempted virus isolation on a number of these products for African swine fever, but none of them have given a positive result. But of course, that doesn't mean to say that they don't pose a risk, because an animal eating such material may be a lot more sensitive than us taking, say, 0.1 of a gram and trying to isolate virus from it.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. So, in terms of identifying, obviously, someone, or I presume yourselves, identified the viral fragments as being FMD. Which particular test was used to establish that?
So this was a molecular test called the PCR test.
Yeah. Okay.
Polymerase chain reaction test.
We all know PCRs pretty well by now, but and just going to that, I'm looking at the AusVet plan, and there's a specific table, table 1.2. It's titled "Laboratory Tests Currently Available at CSIRO for the Diagnosis of FMD." It lists eight different tests on 3 headings. Which of those tests do you do right now where we do not have the live virus in Australia?
We are technically able to do all of them, but there are certain of those, such as virus isolation and characterization of the virus, strain typing for vaccine matching purposes. We're not currently able to do any of those, not for technical reasons, but simply because we don't have the authorization by the relevant authorities in Australia.
And so you absolutely have the capability to do all of those tests in the event that there is a live virus and we need to identify the particular strain and, as you say, vaccine match?
We could do it, but it wouldn't be immediate because we would have to import reference strains from a world reference laboratory in the UK.
So that was going to be my next question. How long would that process take? If we've got a live virus, been identified, it's sent to Geelong, how long does it take to identify what vaccine we need?
Realistically, I think it would be probably 3 to 4 weeks to get the viruses, the reference strains to us, and probably about another 2 weeks to validate and set it up in our laboratories and run the tests themselves. So what we would do in such circumstances, we would send the virus to the Pirbright Institute in UK, and they would do the typing for us, as I understand was currently the case for Indonesia.
That's a little concerning to me because it's not my reading of the AusVet plan. So you're saying it could be 6 weeks before we know which vaccine we'd have to use?
No, I'm saying if it was entirely reliant on us to perform all that work from scratch, if we were to send it to the Pirbright Institute, we would know probably within about 3 or 4 days. Receipt. It might take 2 days to get.
That includes the travel time, is that?
Yeah, it's usually 1 to 2 days.
On top of the 3 or 4, or 3 or 4?
Yes,
total?
on top of the 3 or 4.
Okay, so we're looking
the reason is you have to do the comparative test is one that you have to leave the virus with the antiserum, specific antiserum for a certain period.
And in the meantime, well, that's just so I'm clear. This is my last question. In the meantime, that just so I'm clear. So the live virus we've identified, we sent it to the UK. We get those results back in 5 to 6 days.
Yes.
On the travel, and then meanwhile, though, you'd be ramping up your own ability to do it here in Australia for the ongoing detection and eradication program.
Correct. I would also like to refer to my colleague, Dr. Will Navozlu, who's an expert in foot and mouth, far more knowledgeable than I am on the specifics of these tests.
Happy for anyone to jump in at any time, but over to you, Vilna.
Thank you, Senator. So, of course, there are certain methodologies available to do vaccine matching, but we won't only rely on one assay. So we have the ability to do nucleotide sequencing. So if there is an introduction of a virus, we will be able to determine the serotype, sort of the broader classification of the virus. And through sequencing, we will be able to also determine the particular strain of virus that is causing the introduction. On top of that, we are involved with our neighbours in the region to look at the virus strains that are circulating. So, for example, the specific virus that was introduced into Indonesia was not a surprise to us at all. Through our collaborations with our neighbouring countries in Southeast Asia, we knew what are the current threats in that area. So when the virus arrived in Indonesia, we've actually performed some work through research projects that we've had running over the last 10 years. And we have done some work on that virus. So we actually knew what the vaccine strains would work, what vaccine strains would work against that particular virus. Therefore, we feel prepared. So although we are suffering, or it's a concern that we can't do all the tests ourselves, we are using other opportunities to ensure that we are prepared for any novel introductions.
Thank you very much for that. It's very helpful. I will now go to Senator Ciccone.
Thanks a lot, Chair. Can I just turn to the CSIRO's 2020 biosecurity report? I just wanted to put a couple of questions to you regarding that report that was released 2 years ago, entitled Australia's Biosecurity Future, Unlocking the Next Decade of Resilience. In the report, it states that scaling current approaches will not be enough to mitigate these growing risks, and that business as usual will ensure that the burden of biosecurity threats will only continue to escalate. I can only take from this that for too long biosecurity in this country has not been treated with the level of importance that it has required. Why did the CSIRO make that statement in the report?
Thanks, Senator. I might kick it off and then pass to one of my colleagues. So that, as you note, that report was released in 2020, and but I think we would all agree that as we've established today, that Australia has an enviable biosecurity system. It is truly the envy of the world. But as we've also established, the threats are increasing, and they're coming thicker and faster. And that was one of the key points in that 2020 report. Since then, as Secretary Metcalf has mentioned, there has been investment into the biosecurity sector, but there's still opportunity to do more, as we've established, not just in our report, but certainly in the strategy that's recently been released. But I'll pass to Dr. Shepherd, who may have some additional comments to add.
Yes, thank you, Senator. So I was intimately involved in the preparation of that report. In making that statement, we were actually reflecting information that had already been made available through the Craik Review in 2017. I think the original work that was done behind that statement was actually done by the Department of Fisheries and Forestry themselves, and was then given to the Craik Review and was used. And since the Craik Review, there's been pretty much general acceptance that there is a pressing need to transform the biosecurity system, just scaling up the current biosecurity system would not deliver the need of the protection need that we need as a nation. And that was to some degree addressed by the investment that the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry got in the March budget of 2021 of an extra $400 million.
The report makes very clear that the transformational change to our approach to biosecurity is necessary if we are to maintain our reputation. It's probably the world's leading biosecurity standards, and also being a biosecure trading partner. Can you please talk to how aspects of this important report have been included in the recently announced biosecurity strategy by Minister Watt?
Sure, absolutely, yes. So CSIRO wrote a submission to that strategy, and I was the CSIRO representative on the National Biosecurity Strategy Reference Group. And so throughout the preparation of the strategy, I did my best to make sure that the importance and need for transformational change, particularly supported by science, technology and innovation, was a core component of that strategy going forward. And I think it is adequately captured.
When was CSIRO made aware of foot and mouth disease risk on our northern doorstep?
Yeah, go Trevor.
I can answer that. I first heard about it on the 6th of May, 2022. And this was by an email from a colleague working in the region. I immediately notified Dr. Mark Shep, the Commonwealth Chief Veterinary Officer, and he informed me that he already knew about it.
Okay. So was
This
it
was by email.
a colleague in the region, as in an international colleague?
An international colleague, not a staff member of CSIRO.
Mm. So when was the CSIRO's FMD readiness program commenced?
That's one for Vilma.
We actually have been working on a foot and mouth disease project for the last 12 years. And it was one of these projects that really excites scientists like me, where we received funding from our industry partners, all the industries that would be involved in a foot and mouth disease outbreak, as well as Commonwealth contributions. And it was a truly collaborative approach where we were involving as many partners as possible to start ensuring that we are better prepared for a foot and mouth disease incursion. And the project also looked at better preparedness across a broad range of aspects, right from having a little bit of pre-border information, working with our colleagues overseas to assist them in their diagnostic assays, because if the disease is known in areas where there are introductions, of course, we get better intelligence that way. The project also looked at the efficacy of our vaccine bank. So you've heard before that Australia has a vaccine bank, but of course we need to know what strains need to be included in the bank to ensure that our livestock industries are protected. We've also worked closely with our colleagues in the Department of Agriculture on doing modelling. So in the previous submission, there was some talk about the modelling looking at where vaccination will be used. And that was actually a joint project between CSIRO and the Department of Agriculture to look at how best vaccination can be applied. And in addition to that, we've also been working on some tools that can be utilized during an outbreak to assist with the tracing of the disease that can help with control measures.
So has CSIRO at any stage actually recommended to government about the use of foot mats or increasing the number of vaccines that we need to order?
So we've certainly not played a role in making recommendations in terms of the broader biosecurity. That is not the remit of CSIRO. We do have members that serve on the Vaccine Expert Advisory Group that was also mentioned before, that will provide guidance on vaccines, and so we are involved in that process.
So I guess my point is, though, that had you at any stage said to government, look, we believe that the use of mats is critical in order to reduce the risk to our economy. Have you at any stage made those recommendations to government?
Not that I'm aware of, Senator. Our CSIRO's role is to deliver the science that is an input to policy. So as far as I'm aware, we have not provided a recommendation of that nature to government.
But the recommendation would be based on science, which says if you do have a mat, it would mitigate or at least reduce the risk of foot-mouth disease coming into this country, correct?
Yeah, sorry, I think, Andy, you were going to...
Yeah, if I can provide some clarity. So Trevor and I are on the Science Advisory Committee that advises Secretary Metcalfe in the context of that, and we were present at a specific one around foot and mouth disease, which the Minister attended, where the process of the question around foot mats was certainly discussed, and somebody, I can't remember who, brought up the risk. One of the risk areas of the virus getting into Australia was on footwear. We didn't make that formal recommendation, but neither did we disagree with the recommendation for considering that as a management option.
So what input did you provide at that meeting? And also, when was that meeting?
Yeah, the meeting was about 3 weeks ago. I can look up the date. The advice Trevor led the discussion around foot and mouth disease. So and
had you provided in a similar forum in the previous administration on the issues of foot mats?
No.
Okay. And what about the vaccines? Have you ever been in a similar forum discussing vaccines?
Yes, I have been in the forum of the Animal Health Committee where the potential for use of vaccines was discussed. There are essentially two main ways that you could use such a vaccine. The first is in a suppressive vaccination where you provide a ring vaccination around an outbreak, and this is theoretically supposed to prevent the onward spread of the disease, or at least suppress the spread. But
so when did this meeting occur?
It occurred on the 7th of July.
Okay. So the 7th of July?
Yep.
Okay. And were there any other discussions on vaccines under the last government as well?
As I recollect, there was a meeting of the Animal Health Committee in Darwin. I don't recollect.
Could you take that on notice, just in the interest of time, please? All the meetings?
Yep.
Yep, thank you.
Yep.
Look, Chair, I'm happy to leave my questions there in the interest of time.
Great. Thanks, Senator Ciccone. Appreciate that. Senator McDonald.
Thank you very much. I want to keep going with some of Senator Ciccone's line of questioning around vaccines. It's been brought to my attention during the course of the hearing that New South Wales and Queensland have both committed, and the broad quote is millions of dollars for vaccine to fast track mRNA development and manufacturing capacity in Australia for foot and mouth, so that we don't have to rely on a live virus vaccine out of the country. But the feedback is that the Commonwealth is not as engaged in that discussion. Do you have any input into the development of the mRNA vaccine technology and where that's up to?
I can jump in, and then perhaps Trevor or Vilna can add. So CSIRO has the capability, has the ability to develop mRNA vaccine technology, and we are already commencing some research in those areas, Senator McDonald. So that's certainly an area of keen focus for us. We also, as an organization, have and will have the ability to manufacture mRNA vaccine in small quantities to progress to clinical trials. So that's we're actually opening a facility in Victoria tomorrow. That won't have yet the mRNA capability, but that's definitely in our pipeline to deliver. And perhaps I can pass to Dr. Vosloo to provide some additional comments.
So as Mrs. Rose said, we certainly on our way of looking into mRNA vaccines to use in animal health. We also partnering up with, potentially partnering up with people who are already doing some work in the area. However, we need to also understand that this is a novel area, and that we certainly need to do a bit more research before we can fully apply mRNA vaccines in animals. There's a lot of research that needs to be done to underpin how well mRNA vaccines will work in animals. There are also some other issues around mRNA vaccines regarding cost and stability that may make them a little less attractive to use in the animal health space. So these are all areas that we are busy investigating, and also consulting with partners, or let me say sort of all the stakeholders that would potentially be involved in a vaccine to find out what their needs are.
Okay, that's terrific and sounds quite positive. I assume that you're working closely with the department, the Agricultural Department, to keep them up to date of how you're progressing and what you see the rollout, potential rollout of the development of that technology should you decide that it's cost and speed effective. Terrific, thank you. I want to turn just to a couple of questions that Senator Ciccone had on the foot mats. My understanding is that as they are citric acid, which allows for them to be more user-friendly for the general public, the contact time needs to be 30 minutes in order to effectively kill the foot and mouth virus. And so what we're working on is that the dirt falls off the shoe, the virus falls off the shoe and then has contact with the mat in order to kill it. But it's not actually, the process of walking across the mat is not actually a complete virus barrier, and that in some ways the mats are more about public confidence than they are about effective treatment of the virus. Do I understand that correctly?
Can I take that one? Foot and mouth disease virus is incredibly acid sensitive. So it's one of its weak points in terms of being a virus. So citric acid is actually highly effective in inactivating foot and mouth disease virus. And depending on the concentration of acid that you have, it is actually nearly an immediate process of inactivation. So it's of course important to ensure that the citric acid remains fresh and that the mats remain clear. But yeah, it's a highly efficient way of inactivating the virus.
So when you say depending on the concentration, would the concentration that's in place at airports currently, would that be at that level for an immediate kill for the virus or not?
Senator, I have no idea what the concentration is, but I am fully convinced that people would make sure that it's at the right concentration of how it should be formulated, because that's sort of published information that is well known.
Would I be best directing that, do you think, to the department or to the department, I guess? That would probably be right. Yes, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. No more questions for me.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. Unless there are any other senators, I've just got a couple of questions. Was there someone else? Nope.
Senator Roberts, I have a few short questions.
Senator Roberts.
Chair,
sorry,
but I'm happy to go after you.
No, okay, no problems. Look, I asked earlier about the testing for more the identification of the serotype for vaccine matching. But I just had a more general question about testing in the event of an outbreak. As we learned through COVID, testing became quite crucial. I mean, what can you describe in simple terms? What are the tests available for the average producer, beef producer, let's say, or sheep, who wants to or needs to check whether or not their livestock are infected? How do they do that? And how quickly would you expect the results?
Is that Trevor or Vilna? I'm not sure.
Vilna certainly knows more details about the specific tests that would be used, so I'll pass to.
Senator, at the moment, if farmers suspect that they do have foot and mouth disease, they have to contact their local veterinary services, government services, to be involved in the diagnostics, because it's really crucial how the samples are collected and what type of samples are collected. So it is not an action that we would expect a local person to do. It will have to be done with the local authorities. The samples will then be sent to the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness as quickly as possible. And then we have several tests that can be utilised. We rely a lot on the PCR, and that is quite a rapid test. We also have an ELISA-based assay that can detect the antigen. So that test is run concurrent with the PCR at the moment, and the results are out in about 3 to 4 hours. after it has arrived here at ACDP. So,
I suppose my concern. Sorry, go on. You can finish.
Sorry, I mean, I can get completely carried away, so if
Well, that's great. Well, I'm glad we have people like you, Vilna. We need more. So, my only concern with that is not so much at your end, just the logistics of this. A lot of these properties are remote, and so who comes out and takes this? Is it swabs? Is that the right way to describe it? Who has to do that? Does it have to be a trained veterinarian or a public servant, an official in the Department of Agriculture? What are the logistics here?
So there is the emergency hotline, and of course the department always puts a lot of focus on the fact that people should be calling the emergency hotline once they suspect that there's foot and mouth disease on their premises. That will then put a whole cascade of processes into place, which again would be much better to talk to the department about, because that is fully their remit.
So you don't know, do we know how many people are trained in the country to take these swabs?
No, that's something that you'll have to ask the department.
And with the PCR testing at your end, I know in theory, as you said, it can come back in 3 or 4 hours. Again, drawing comparisons with COVID, though, often when we did have large outbreaks, it started to come up to bottlenecks, and so suddenly the PCR tests were taking days, multiple days to come back to people. What's the capacity at your laboratories to do this? At what point do you sort of have modelling on how many infected properties would we get to before you'd be overwhelmed and the 3 to 4 hours would be much longer because there's a backlog?
So I can take that one if you like. We have a capacity here to perform around 1,000 PCR tests a day here at ACDP. However, as the National Reference Laboratory, our main focus is providing confirmatory diagnosis. Each of the states and jurisdictions have their own state or jurisdictional veterinary laboratory, or a contract with a laboratory to perform such testing, and they may well be providing some of the testing capability, particularly around demonstrating freedom or surveillance type testing, where there's no overt suspicion, but which they just want to generate the data to be sure. So we work as a network and we work as a team, and in peacetime, ACDP works with the state laboratories in assuring competency in that testing as well.
Can I just go back to the logistics? And I thought I heard from Vilna before. Sorry, I don't know your last name, Vilna, but for informal, I thought I heard that the swabs that collected would go to Geelong, but they could go somewhere else, could they? They could go to state-based laboratories that would be able to do the same testing that occurs at Geelong to just identify the virus. Is that correct? No, they'd have to go to Geelong.
No, they would have to go to Geelong if there was any suspicion of disease. As I explained, the state and jurisdictional laboratories may do other sort of testing for demonstrating freedom, for instance. So serological tests looking for antibody rather than looking for the virus.
Oh, okay. So there's no, at this stage, to your knowledge, there's no capacity at the state level to do a PCR or an assay or other tests to identify an infection as such?
No, and there's a particular additional hurdle for foot and mouth disease because it is a security sensitive biological agent. So this has very stringent controls over the biosecurity around any laboratory that's receiving samples which may contain the virus.
Are there other laboratories in Australia that have that level of accreditation that could do this testing if they had the equipment?
I believe 1 or 2,
right,
but there's not many at this time.
Okay, and that 1,000 tests a day you mentioned, are there other requirements on that? There sort of PCR tests for other viruses that would have to be done, or you've got 1,000 that you could just devote to FMD?
We've got 1,000 that we would devote just to FMD. Of course, this doesn't preclude the possibility of other notifiable disease submissions coming in for other diseases. We test about 1,500 investigations, probably totaling 5,000 or 6,000 samples a year, just to exclude these diseases. So some of that would likely continue.
And my final question, what's the level of cooperation you've got with Indonesian authorities at the moment? Are you helping there at all? And do they have sort of equivalent testing capabilities that you've just described that are here?
Yes, it was quite prescient that the Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade had previously funded a project which we have been running in Indonesia, and it's called the BICALAB project, and it is to develop laboratory capability for exotic animal diseases in Indonesia. So we have been working very closely with Indonesian colleagues in developing that capability there in Indonesia.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and I'll go to Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for attending today. My understanding is that there are some aspects of the foot and mouth diagnostics that are not being done permanently in this country. If that's correct, what would CSIRO need to upgrade the lab capability to move that permanently to Australia? Is it a lack of capability, technical or mechanical, or is it a lack of approvals?
Sorry.
Go ahead,
sorry,
sorry.
I do apologise.
No, go ahead, please.
ACDP does have the technical capability and fully meets all of the biosecurity requirements and biosafety requirements around handling foot and mouth disease. But because the risk was considered to be greater than the need, hitherto we've not been licensed to hold foot and mouth disease virus. The same was recently true for lumpy skin disease, but we've recently been given permission to now import that virus and start to do some research on it.
So what's needed to improve the capability on foot and mouth itself if you've already got lumpy skin disease capability?
I'd like to pass that to Vilna because she would be more closely involved in what we might do with foot and mouth specifically.
So Senator, it's really not a matter of lack of capability. It's more an inability to fully validate our assays. So we have everything in place, but because we don't have access to the live virus, we have difficulties in ensuring that our assays will be working. So the way that we've dealt with that in the past, again, under the research projects that we've been running, is to take our assays overseas to areas where we have access to the live virus or to samples that are suitable to validate our assays, and to ensure that what we're using in Australia will be working. But we're always sort of, having this challenge in a sense that, we know we have the assays, but we can't validate them here. We have to go and validate them elsewhere and bring it back.
So what's involved in making sure you can have the capability of validating here rather than overseas? Is it some risk management, or is it some other risk management skills?
I might jump in, Senator. This type of work that Vilna is describing is exactly what ACDP was built to do. And we have really the only lab in the Southern Hemisphere that can handle these security-sensitive biological agents at this scale. And lumpy skin disease is an example of where we are in the process of importing that live virus so that we can do the work. As Vilna said, the capability is there, the security, the biosafety, all of those things are in place. It's the absence of the live virus, which would be a regulatory process we would need to go through to enable its importation. That is a relatively complicated process to go through, but it is one that we've been navigating with our departments and our colleagues in the department and the government with lumpy skin disease. So it's an understood process, I suppose.
What was that last statement, Ms. Rose?
It's the process of importation of these SSBAs. We do understand the process of how to do it because we're doing it with lumpy skin disease.
So it's really regulatory approval to do it.
That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you. Next, I'm getting a bit frustrated with the discussion, not with the people who are at the committee at the inquiry right now, but with other people last week in Parliament and the week before in Parliament and today. vaccine storage in this country, foot and mouth vaccine storage. Are you aware of what's needed for vaccine storage? And could you tell us, please, if you are?
Trevor?
Yes, the requirements are essentially liquid nitrogen. They're usually held in vapor phase of liquid nitrogen. When they're manufactured, the virus is live, but they go through a rigorous inactivation process and are then distributed in inactivated form. So they don't require a high level of biosecurity, but they do require being kept cold. Once the vaccines have been formulated, the temperature requirements are much less, 2 to 8 degrees. So they could be held at that temperature once they're fully formulated and ready to go into the animal. Vilna, you've also had experience with vaccine banks and storage.
Yes, so maybe if I can just try and explain a little bit. So we're looking at two different issues. So the one is the stored antigen. So that's just the virus particle that has been killed, and that sits in the liquid nitrogen vapor. And the reason we do that is that it then has a very long shelf life. As long as it is just in that antigen form, we can store it for several years. So at the moment, the vaccine bank is there for 5 years. Once it's formulated into vaccine, then the shelf life becomes much shorter. So I think at the moment it's 18 months. And as Trevor said, the storage conditions is less stringent, but you then sit with a limited shelf life. So if we import the formulated vaccine, we will have to move that over on a regular basis, which will have a cost implication. So I am one of the people serving on the Vaccine Expert Advisory Group, and we are actually at the moment looking at what the requirements will be if we do bring in the formulated vaccine into the country.
So if we need to use them because it arrives in this country, then it's just a matter of doing the cost benefit analysis. But until then, it's very much unknown. So the costs, well, we don't know the benefits.
There's also another issue, Senator, that's quite important at the moment, is that the vaccine manufacturers are running full steam ahead because it's not just foot-and-mouth disease in Indonesia. There are several other areas of the world where there's now new outbreaks and changes in the epidemiological situation. So the vaccine manufacturers are struggling to produce sufficient vaccine to provide the world. And if you want to order a vaccine when there's not an emergency, you may not be able to access the vaccine in the time frame that you would want to have it. An emergency would be different, and especially for Australia, who has a vaccine bank. But outside an emergency, there's some waiting times now to get access to vaccines.
Thank you, Ms. Foslu. Where are the vaccines made? How many countries?
Yeah, you're asking me something that I'm not sure, but there are quite a number of vaccine manufacturers. So there's some in Europe and in South America. And then there are manufacturers that also provide locally to their own countries. So there's several of them, but a few internationally recognized companies that countries like Australia, that's free of the disease, would access.
Yeah, so we already have 1 million stored in the UK. What difference would it make to bring them over here? Now, I mean, they've got an 18-month shelf life, but we've got faster access if they're stored in this country rather than stored in the UK.
The replacement time may be a bit of an issue. So if we bring them in and we know that they're going to have a shelf life of 18 months, we need to replace those 1 million doses within that 18-month period, and that might be a problem. But it's something that we're still busy investigating.
So are you alluding to the possibility that the vaccines we have on storage in the UK if they're not used within that 18 months, they're shipped somewhere where they can be used quickly, in a country that already has foot and mouth disease, and then they're upgraded in our storage for us.
So that could be a potential way of looking at it. But there's so many complexities around it, Senator, in terms of then being able, if we bring it in, to be able to export it again, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe it's a little bit too early to talk about it since we're still investigating all these issues.
Okay, thank you for your openness. Final question, Chair. The swabs from cattle that may be infected with foot and mouth disease, will these be transported around our nation? And if so, what security is involved to make sure that the virus doesn't spread?
Trevor, did you want to jump in there? Because if they're swabbed on farm, they will make their way to Geelong, and that's again something that we manage on a regular basis.
Yes, that's right. Any investigation that's carried out anywhere in Australia, the samples would be shipped to ACDP and tested here by those molecular tests that my colleague Dr. Vosloo described.
So what sort of security arrangements are in place for making sure that the transportation is secure?
So they follow the standard requirements of the IATA regulations in terms of making sure that the package doesn't get split open or spill. But as far as actual security rather than biosafety and
biosafety is what I meant by security.
Yeah. So they will be inside there is an IATA definition called 3373. Which requires a sealed container with a taped seal inside a second container with absorbent material inside a tertiary container containing CO2 and packing materials, and to protect the samples.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair. And I want to thank the witnesses for their patience and cooperation, because we're well over. Mute.
Yep, got it. Thank you, Senator Roberts. Thank you to everyone. I've just got a couple of quick questions on vaccines following on to Senator Roberts, and then we'll close. I think, and you might not be able to answer these. Tell me if you can't. From my reading, vaccination will have to occur every 6 months. Is that correct?
So it again, Senator, it depends a little bit on where the situation that you're using the vaccines. So for Australia, for example, we will be importing what we call a high potency vaccine. So it is a vaccine that actually contains quite a lot of the virus antigen that I've mentioned before. And the idea would be that you're only going to give one vaccination because it is in an emergency and you want to use it to just suppress the disease, right. Control the disease. In endemic areas where they are vaccinating because the disease is around, okay. Yes, you have to vaccinate every 6 months.
It's a lower potency every 6 months.
It's lower potency every 6 months.
Well, that's what I thought I'd read. That clears that up. If we've given an animal the high potency vaccine, how long is it before they're considered free of the virus, if you like? I presume they're getting a sort of as you mentioned, some viral fragments or some such in the vaccine. So how long before they can actually be designated as free?
So again, you'll probably have to stop me because now I'm getting really excited.
Yes.
This is the type of work that we've done. That's exactly more to look at what stage will the animals be protected. So of course, once you give them, so our animals are all naive. They have not seen foot and mouth disease virus before.
Yes.
So we were looking at if you do apply a vaccine to an animal, how soon will they be protected against infection? Now, the problem with foot and mouth disease vaccine is a little bit like the COVID vaccine. The animals will be protected against clinical disease, but not necessarily infection. So you might still have the fact that the animal becomes infected, but they won't develop clinical disease. But with a high potency vaccine, the animals are protected as soon as around 7 days post-vaccination. So it is a really effective tool in terms of control. It's not the only tool that will be used during a control effort, but certainly can be a very effective tool should we decide to use vaccination.
So because of the fact that it doesn't protect completely against transmission, there'd still be a need for movement restrictions, etc., most likely.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. I've just got one very final one. You mentioned earlier the CSIRO submission to the biosecurity strategy. Is that public? That might be for someone else.
It was certainly sent in through the public process, so assuming that all of those submissions are online, then it will be public. But we can provide.
Could you take that on notice if you can provide us a copy? Just
we can certainly provide you with a copy. Absolutely.
Okay, that's fantastic.
It is public, Senator, and we can provide
if you could provide it, that'd be great to the committee. And when was that submitted?
I think it was back in January when the call went out.
Okay.
It was within the time frame of the call, anyway.
Maybe you could take that on notice then to get us the date. And just on, if there are no other questions from senators, just on that, we have set next Friday, the 19th of August, for the return of any questions on notice. Thank you, and thank you again for your patience and forbearance. Sorry, we have gone a lot longer than expected. But that concludes today's hearings. Thank you to all the witnesses, and especially to Hansard and Broadcasting and the Secretariat for all of their assistance. The committee stands now adjourned.